A king once cries out that the world should pause so that people can sit on the ground and speak of the deaths of rulers. Behind this dramatic image lies one of the oldest questions in human history: whether a king's existence truly ends with death, or somehow escapes it. From the earliest appearance of kingship to its transformation in later ages, the meaning of royal power has always depended on how death was understood. In the earliest traditions, the king was expected to die, and his role was therefore limited and finite. In later traditions, the king was imagined as never truly dying, and his existence took on an unlimited significance. Kingship itself did not exist apart from these beliefs. It was shaped by them. The king lived his life either moving steadily toward death or reaching endlessly toward life, depending on what destiny he believed awaited him. The ancient Sumerian city of Erech provides one of the clearest windows into this way of thinking. Much of what survives from early Sumerian literature focuses on the kings of this city, their deeds, and their suffering. Erech seems to have provided a model for sacred kingship across Sumer and may have stood at the foundation of the earliest urban civilization. Most striking of all, the traditions surrounding its kings reveal an unexpected understanding of royal death. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of one of Erech's most famous kings and his lifelong struggle against mortality. His early life unfolds without any real awareness of death. Like many people, he assumes that death happens to others, not to himself. This illusion ends abruptly when he sees corpses drifting down the Euphrates. From that moment, his life changes direction. At first, he seeks lasting fame, hoping that his name will survive after his body is gone. Yet this kind of immortality feels hollow when his closest companion Enkidu dies. From then on, Gilgamesh becomes obsessed with a single goal: not life after death, but life without death, an endless existence in this world. This raises a question that still matters today. Is such a search even possible? Or must humans choose between accepting death and ignoring it? The fact that later thinkers, including alchemists, sought elixirs of life suggests that the quest did not disappear with antiquity. Over time, this dream may even have shifted into modern scientific hopes. Life is still being extended, disease resisted, and aging delayed, though no one openly claims that death itself can be abolished. Immortality has become a distant limit rather than a realistic goal, something approached but never fully reached. In this sense, eternal life is not a technical problem waiting for a solution. It is a mystery. Stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, do not solve that mystery, but attempt to explain it. They do so through myth, not by denying the mystery, but by giving it shape. In these stories, humans cannot seize eternal life by force. If it is ever granted, it must be given. One explanation offered is renewal. Life continues by being restored again and again. Gilgamesh is told of a plant that can return youth, and although he finds it, a serpent steals it, renewing itself in the process. The survivor of the great flood is granted eternal life in a renewed world, almost as if creation itself has begun again. Another explanation points to continuous growth. Evergreen trees, untouched by seasonal death, seem to embody unending life. Gilgamesh's expedition into the cedar forest can be understood as a challenge to forces believed to monopolize life itself. Yet even these trees can be cut down, suggesting that this explanation is incomplete. A third explanation is destiny. Eternal life belongs only to those whose fate has been shaped so that nothing can ever bring about their death. Most people are not destined for this. Death is not seen as the result of natural decay, but as the outcome of a predetermined path. Finally, there is a deeper idea: that kingship and eternal life cannot coexist. One ancient story tells of a ruler who is offered eternal life but refuses it in exchange for knowledge and authority. Choosing kingship means accepting mortality. Eternal life belongs to the gods, while rule on earth belongs to humans. In this view, the gods are defined by their deathlessness. To seek eternal life is to seek entry into their realm. Yet Gilgamesh learns that he was destined to rule, not to live forever. Kingship itself marks the boundary. Human rule begins only when divine rule ends, and with it comes death, struggle, and suffering. Another tradition turns the story in a darker direction. The figure known later as Tammuz, and earlier as Dumuzi, was once a king of Erech. He was not originally thought to return from death, but to descend into the underworld so that a goddess could return to the living world. Over time, this idea may have extended to all kings of Erech. Each king, by dying, made possible the renewal of divine order and fertility. Royal death was not an accident, but a requirement. Gilgamesh's resistance to this fate is central to his story. When the city goddess desires him, he refuses her, listing the tragic ends of her former lovers, all kings who met violent deaths. By the time the epic took its final form, the death of the king had become a central feature of sacred kingship across Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh understands that accepting the goddess means accepting the same destiny. His refusal is an attempt to escape the ancient pattern. The story suggests that the goddess went down into the underworld not because she was forced, but because she wanted to meet death face to face, to taste it as the deepest possible experience. The poem about her descent opens with a striking image. Her thoughts turn toward the world below, toward the land of the dead. In the same deliberate way, another hero is described as turning his thoughts toward a distant realm of life. The movement is presented as a choice, almost like an appetite for a forbidden kind of knowledge. In that sense, the goddess resembles the figure who reaches for the fruit that brings an awareness of good and evil. A moment that also introduces death into the human story. In the older tale, the serpent has to persuade the human that eating will not end everything, that it will bring a godlike kind of understanding. The goddess, in a similar spirit, does not go blindly. Before she crosses the threshold, she sends instructions to the cunning god who can set a rescue in motion. She makes sure there is a path back. Once she enters the underworld, the narrative becomes harsh and physical. She is seized by the powers of that realm, stripped of her status piece by piece, dragged before the queen of the dead, and executed. Then comes the image that turns the descent into a public shock. Her naked body displayed on a stake for 3 days and 3 nights, hung like a warning in the architecture of the underworld itself. Only after that fixed span does the rescue begin. Through the schemes of the cunning god, life is forced back into her, and she is revived. Yet the underworld does not release what it has taken without a price. Her return is permitted only if another is provided as a substitute. The logic is cold, the dead must be paid with the living. And the choice she makes is not random. Like a figure who invites a partner to share the fatal fruit, she selects her mate, the king, to undergo what she has undergone. He is seized and carried away to take her place below. That sequence pushes straight into a question that sounds simple, but is difficult to settle. Can death be tasted at all? People speak that way, as though death were an experience like bitterness on the tongue. Yet some thinkers argue that death cannot be lived through. An event can only be experienced by someone who exists, and death seems to erase the very condition that makes experience possible. From this angle, life can be finite, but still feel unbounded, like the sky above the earth. Vision has limits, but the eye does not see an edge to the sky. In the same way, a person may not encounter a final boundary inside experience itself. If death is absolute non-being, then the desire to taste it is empty, because there is nothing there to taste. But the ancient story seems to assume something different. It treats death not as a blank void, but as a realm one can enter, a condition one can undergo, a threshold that can be crossed and then crossed back. Under that assumption, the phrase, "to taste death," is not just a metaphor, it becomes a possibility inside the myth's world. This creates tension with another common idea. Gods are usually defined as the deathless ones. Yet here, a goddess deliberately moves toward the land of death. The tradition seems to hint at a different definition of divinity, one that centers not only on living forever, but on understanding the full structure of life and death. The two ideas are not simply confused, they can be read as linked. Eternal life is not fully understood without understanding what ends life. The methods of preserving life correspond to the reasons life fails, like the way a cure makes sense only when the illness is understood. To possess endless life by one's own nature, rather than receiving it as a gift, would require a total grasp of what death is and how it works. Some versions of the older human story even imply that knowledge is sought in order to locate life itself, as though the point of learning good and evil were to reach the secret of life. The goddess's descent reflects a more direct and more dangerous idea. Knowledge is gained by going into death and returning. Another layer emerges when the king's fate is placed beside hers. If the king is taken as her substitute, then his death is not only his own. It becomes a shared event, something the city undergoes with him. Ancient laments describe a grieving city with the same language used for ruined cities, as though the death of the ruler is experienced like civic collapse. Later, seasonal mourning rituals for dying gods may preserve an echo of this older intensity, a memory of a time when royal death was felt as the community's own crisis. The king, by passing through death, is imagined as crossing into a new status. He becomes like a divine figure who knows good and evil, and in some traditions he is pictured as ruling in the underworld. The Queen of the Dead is said to place into his hands a tablet linked to wisdom. The symbolism is clear. Authority below is tied to knowledge, not merely to power. If the king receives this wisdom through death, then the people, by grieving and participating emotionally in that death, are imagined to share in it indirectly. This idea clashes with the claim that death is strictly private and cannot be anticipated through another person's experience. It is true that watching someone die does not erase the fact that one's own death still waits. Yet the early ritual view does not treat the king's death as a private act. It is staged, mourned, and absorbed by the city. And there is no obvious reason to assume that a shared experience must be shallow just because it is shared. If anything, a death carried out for others intensifies the link. When one person dies in a role that benefits others, the witnesses may feel, more sharply than usual, that their own death has been postponed rather than removed. The future becomes visible. Death is perceived not as an abstraction, but as a scheduled meeting that has merely been delayed. The myths that grow around these scenes function like formal reports of what the culture believes has been learned. The wisdom the king is thought to gain is tied to fate, to the idea that the time of death is fixed. The tablet associated with the ruler of the dead is imagined as carrying the hour of every person's end. In this framework, destiny is not a vague force. It is a decree. The community, by sharing in the king's death through grief and ritual, is believed to acquire at least one piece of that wisdom, the certainty that every person must die. The exact timing remains hidden, and only special experiences are said to reveal it. Dreams become important here. A dream is treated as a rehearsal of death. an early crossing into that boundary zone, and for that reason it can reveal the shape of fate more completely than ordinary awareness. In one tradition, it is through a dream that the great king learns he was meant to rule, but not meant to escape death. Kingship itself is described as a fixed term, a limited tenure. The ruler holds power for a span determined elsewhere, and when that span ends, authority returns to its source. At the end of a reign, power reverts to the civic assembly that originally granted it, and behind that assembly stands an older image, the Council of the Gods, believed to speak through the gathering of human leaders. A broader reversal is imagined when the dominant city loses its power and kingship passes elsewhere through war. And there is an even larger reset in flood traditions, where human rule is wiped away entirely and the world is returned to its original condition, so that kingship must be granted again from above as though history has restarted. In the same rhythm, human bodies are said to return to clay. The cycle that promises renewal also explains mortality. The return that keeps the world young is also the return that drags individual lives back to their beginning. Within this world of limits, a different kind of immortality still exists. It is not endless living, but lasting presence. A king may not escape death, yet he can escape being forgotten. After recognizing death for the first time, the great ruler decides to establish a name where lasting names already stand. And even where none yet stand, to raise markers that will endure. The distant forest of evergreens becomes the symbolic place for this project because its trees seem to resist seasonal decay. The landscape itself looks like an argument against the cycle of dying and return. Yet the narrative also suggests another path to the same outcome. Even if the king dies in the attempt to defeat the guardian of that forest, the story of that death will spread. People will speak of it for generations. In that sense, the king can become evergreen in memory. His death, experienced and mourned by the community, ensures that he continues to live in human recollection, beyond the ordinary cycle of fading away. Still, this kind of survival is not equal to true deathlessness. Memory can preserve a name, but it does not prevent the grave. So why would kingship ever be chosen over eternal life? The answer offered by the tradition is that kingship is tied to a deeper prize, the knowledge gained through death. Whether the choice is presented as a brave decision or as a deception by a cunning power, the value of the chosen path is linked to insight. Through contact with death, the culture imagines that understanding becomes possible, the kind of understanding that could one day allow a being to possess life endlessly by its own right, not as a borrowed gift. Even the gods in these stories sometimes enter the underworld. A sky deity is said to descend there at one time, and the city goddess is imagined to repeat her descent and return again and again. The choice between life and knowledge is therefore not merely a moral test. It becomes a strategic choice between two kinds of immortality. One is received freely from a higher power, a gift that does not require comprehension. The other is earned through the dangerous work of knowing life and death from the inside. To choose knowledge in this logic is to choose the long route to godlike status. Not merely to live, but to become the kind of being that understands why life ends and how it might be held without dependence on anyone else. In that final picture, the goal is not simply to avoid death. It is to become like the immortals by learning what death truly is, and by returning from it with wisdom. A society can be understood by watching how it places the living beside the dead. In many modern cultures that call themselves progressive or revolutionary, the bond is deliberately weakened. The present claims the right to stand on its own, and the dead are treated as something finished, something that must not rule the choices of the living. That distance is not a minor detail. It helps define what progress or revolution means in practice because the living insist on independence from what came before. In older classical settings, the connection can look very different. A community may feel obligated to the dead, and that obligation can become a source of strength against the commands of the powerful. A famous dramatic example shows a woman performing burial rites for her brother even when a king forbids it, and the act becomes a declaration that the laws of rulers do not fully control human duty. In the ancient Near East, and especially in Egypt, the bond becomes stronger still. There, the relationship between the living and the dead is not mainly about freedom from the past or freedom from political authority. It becomes a structure of intense mutual dependence, an interlocked system in which the living and the dead are imagined to need each other. Egypt is the clearest case for seeing how far this could go. Even the way the kingdom was described and imagined seems to point toward a double landscape, a realm of daily life and a realm of the dead. The enormous pyramids rising above the desert are the most obvious sign of that focus. They are not subtle monuments. They declare that death and what follows it were central concerns. Modern observers sometimes try to soften this conclusion by arguing that the evidence is misleading. Tombs, inscriptions, and funerary objects survived because the desert preserved them, while ordinary things connected to daily life decayed in the damp soil of the river valley. That may explain part of what remains, but it does not settle the deeper question. A culture is not necessarily unhealthy because it looks directly at death. It may be more stable than a culture that tries to push death out of sight. Egypt's long endurance across more than 2,000 years, and its ability to recover after major periods of collapse, may have been supported by an outlook that allowed people to face death openly and even with confidence, rather than treating it as a taboo that must be repressed in order to live happily. That confidence, however, was not unbreakable. After one early breakdown in the country's stability, a more sceptical mood appears in a poem often known as the Song of the Harper. Its voice is blunt. A person cannot carry property into the next world, and no traveller returns to describe what lies beyond. If nothing can be taken, then enjoyment must be taken now. If no one returns, then the afterlife cannot be known with certainty, and it is safer to concentrate on the pleasures that are tangible. This is not just casual advice. It cuts against a long tradition in which rulers spent much of their lives organising their tomb projects and surrounding themselves with the machinery of their future burial, as if the afterlife required careful preparation and constant investment. The same period also produced a bleak and intimate text in which a person debates suicide. The speaker rejects the idea of drowning pain in pleasure, not because pleasure has no appeal, but because it would stain reputation and leave behind a name that rots. Death is not simply an escape in this argument. Death is imagined as release from a world where trust and honesty have collapsed, where there seems to be no one left to speak to. More than that, death is described as a promotion. The dead are said to become like gods. This was not an unusual phrase in Egypt. The death of an important person could be described as a transformation into a divine state. In the suicide text, the dead person is pictured as a living power, judging wrongdoing, punishing the sinner, travelling with the sun through the dangerous night passage, and speaking with the sun god in wisdom. Under that vision, death can appear desirable rather than terrifying, and the soul is persuaded to accept it, even when the chosen form of death is violent. Yet this raises a difficult issue. What survives exactly? Does the person remain the same? Or does something more anonymous take over? The tradition answers in a way that is both reassuring and unsettling. To become divine at death often meant to become Osiris. At first, Osiris was closely tied to the dead king and to rulership in the underworld. Over time, this identification spread. Not only kings but ordinary dead people could be spoken of as Osiris, which creates an obvious tension. If everyone becomes Osiris, how can Osiris remain a single ruler over the dead? One solution is to emphasize his role as judge, the one who admits the worthy and rejects the guilty. In that role, authority can remain even if many are linked to the same divine name. Alongside this judicial role, however, Osiris has another identity. He is also the life of vegetation, the grain that grows. His death is pictured not only as murder, but also as drowning, echoing the way the land disappears under the floodwaters and then returns in green abundance. But if the dead are absorbed into that cycle, personal identity becomes thinner. Being merged with the grain that grows each year is a very different thing from continuing as a recognizable individual. This ancient image of a dead god of nature has an eerie resemblance to a modern claim that God is dead. A phrase used in some traditions to describe the collapse of belief in a personal deity who rescues human beings from death. In that modern vision, what emerges after the collapse is the autonomy of the human spirit, standing alone without external salvation. If that modern story is translated out of history and placed into a repeating cycle, it begins to resemble the older mythic pattern. Instead of a single decisive collapse, the god would be abolished again and again in recurring incarnations, and life would return in seasonal rhythms. Nature would take the place of history as the stage on which spirit appears. In Egyptian myth, Osiris is said to have once been alive as a king, a divine presence embodied in human form. But the living god is always placed in the past. Ask about that king, and it turns out Osiris was the predecessor. Ask again, and the living Osiris retreats further back. The story pushes the moment of the god's living presence away from the present. In every present, the god is dead. The idea that Osiris once lived carries the flavour of remote beginnings. The claim that Osiris is dead, by contrast, functions like a permanent truth that repeats in every generation. Each reigning ruler, when he dies, is said to become Osiris, and Osiris is said to have been killed by Set. In effect, the divine figure and the human embodiment are struck down in the same blow. And what rises afterward is not the same individual again, but the universal force of life visible in crops, vegetation, and renewal. When Egyptians spoke about what a person becomes after death, they used a term that can be understood as a transformed or transfigured spirit. The language suggests usefulness, power, and a kind of shining effectiveness rather than a private individual continuing unchanged. It may be closer to imagine a difference between individuality and personhood. Individual traits may fade, but something like personhood could persist as spirit, existing in a less narrow way than it did in a single human life. The dead are often described collectively as a group of transformed spirits who support the living king. This is not a gathering of named individuals holding on to personal biographies. It is an anonymous force made up of all who have passed into the Osiris condition, a reservoir of spiritual power believed to operate through the ruler and through the seasonal world the ruler governs, with its patterns of drought, flood, and growth. In that framework, life after death is not chiefly about surviving as a separate self. It is about surviving through the living. One title connected with Osiris means something like the one who lives again, and its meaning points to succession. Osiris is dead in himself, yet he lives again through his son Horus, who rules in the land of the living. When burial customs spread beyond kings to ordinary people, the same logic spreads as well. A person's hope depends on having someone who remains behind. A survivor stands at the grave, performs the rites, maintains the tomb, and keeps the channel open. Without that continuing care, contact between dead and living breaks down. The dead are left without access to the life of the community. The practical function of the rituals is to keep the body from sliding into complete oblivion, to keep some strand of identity anchored in the ongoing world. This can be compared to a form of immortality that is neither personal survival in the strongest sense, nor complete disappearance into an impersonal cosmic force. It resembles the idea of the dead continuing because they are taken up by the living, not merely remembered as names, but absorbed into an ongoing life that carries traces forward. In ordinary terms, people already say that someone lives on in memory. Expand that notion beyond fragile human memory, and imagine a living spirit, fully present within the world itself, and the result comes close to what ancient Egypt seems to picture. Death would end direct personal awareness, but it would not erase the deceased entirely. Something would remain as an active trace inside other lives, present in the living world as a real component of its ongoing vitality. In Egypt, the dead and the living king were described through a clean division of roles. The departed ruler was linked to Osiris, the sovereign of the underworld. The reigning ruler was linked to Horus, the power that governs the world of daylight and breath. That pairing creates an unusual bridge to a later religious idea found in Hebrew tradition: the insistence on a living God. A striking moment appears in a dispute about resurrection, where the argument turns on a simple phrase. God is named as the God of ancestors, who are known to have died, and yet he is described as the God of the living rather than the dead. The logic presses in one direction. If this God belongs to the living, then those ancestors must be counted among the living in some sense, even if their deaths are recorded. That thought effectively forces open the door to resurrection, or at least to the claim that death does not have final possession. What gives that argument its weight is that it draws on assumptions already familiar within the tradition of the people being addressed. There is a long strand in Hebrew religion that concentrates on life in this world, rather than on a detailed system of an immortal soul or a fully developed doctrine of bodily resurrection. In that older outlook, the hope of the dead is closely tied to the life of descendants. The future of a family, the survival of a name, and the continuity of a people matter more than an individual's separate continuation beyond the grave. That perspective also carries echoes that resemble Egypt in one important way. The dead do not stand alone. Their existence is entwined with the life of those who remain. Pharaohs sought to endure through successors, and patriarchs were remembered as living through their posterity. And yet, the two worlds are not identical. Egypt's solution depends heavily on a divine force that lives inside the visible order and is repeatedly embodied in kingship. A living power is thought to be active in the ruler and, through him, in the land's rhythms and renewal. When that living quality is moved away from the world and placed in a God who stands above it, the older solution no longer works by itself. The result is a gap. If the living God is not simply the life of the world continuing through successors, then another answer must explain how the dead can be alive to him. This is where the later idea of resurrection becomes necessary. The dead ruler is alive to Horus because the energy of life that once animated the old king is believed to be present in the new one. The dead ancestor is alive to the living God because that God is believed to have both the will and the power to restore the dead to life. The structure remains similar, but the mechanism changes. The continuity that in Egypt runs through an earthly king becomes, in the Hebrew and later Christian framing, a continuity grounded in the power of a transcendent deity. Even that contrast has limits, because Egyptian religion is not purely earthbound in its imagery, and Hebrew religion is not purely distant in its God. Horus is not only a force inside the palace, he is also imagined as a sky power, visible in the falcon and in the heights above. And the biblical God is not only the God of heaven, he is also portrayed as entering history, drawing near, and in Christian belief becoming present in a human life. The same pattern appears on the darker side as well. The living Horus implies the dead Osiris, because the life force is imagined as repeatedly losing its old form when a king dies, and then taking a new form when a successor rises. In later Western thought, once God is believed to have been present in a human life, the idea of God's death also becomes thinkable. But in that modern version, the death is not simply the physical death of a person. It is imagined as a loss of divine presence through rejection and denial in collective consciousness. The distance between Egypt's Osiris and modern talk of a dead god is therefore large, but it is not infinite. Both wrestle with how a sacred presence can be said to disappear and yet still matter. A broader connection appears when attention shifts from kingship to a different Egyptian idea: the world as shaped by mind and speech. In later Christian language, life is described as present in the Logos, a rational principle through which all things exist. Egypt had a comparable image in the figure of Ptah, a creator described as the heart and tongue of the gods. In other words, creation is tied not to brute, physical force, but to thought and command. This was a step away from older pictures in which creation happens through bodily action and raw generative power. Even older versions, however, sometimes hint at the later theme, because naming is treated as a creative act. To name a thing is to bring it into order and reality. This heart and tongue principle is not kept at a distance. It is said to be present in the pharaoh through qualities associated with understanding and authoritative speech. The ruler's command is not merely political. It is pictured as the vehicle through which truth is made effective. Truth is not treated as an abstract idea floating above life. It is treated as reality itself, and reality is treated as what living beings feed on. A person who protests innocence speaks as though truth is nourishment. In that environment, the rational order of the world and the moral order of society are interlocked. How such a vision is judged depends on what someone believes about reason and fact. One approach treats the world as fundamentally irrational at its base and sees claims about a rational principle as imaginative decoration. Another approach denies that mere fact is ultimate and insists that reason must be the backbone of reality. A third approach, which later Christianity emphasizes, introduces an additional layer: the idea that beyond both reason and brute fact, there is a level of meaning that is not fully captured by either. In that view, the world includes mystery, something neither irrational nor simply rational, but beyond both. Egypt's version of the Logos-like principle remains distinct because it is not presented as a distant reality, stepping into the world from outside. It is presented as a power already inside the world that becomes visible in certain moments and persons. The language used for a new king's accession is telling. The king is said to appear as a god. The sense is not that a faraway being travels downward into flesh, but that a hidden presence becomes manifest where it had been latent. The movement is from concealment to visibility, from silent immanence to public appearance. This symbolism becomes vivid in the way Egyptian religion links kingship to the first emergence of land from primal waters. Each year, as the flood recedes, small mounds of mud rise above the surface as the first promise of renewed life. The same image is projected backward into the beginning of the world. When the original waters withdraw, the first hill of earth appears, and from that emergence creation begins. The new pharaoh is imagined in a similar shape, like a sunrise and like the first mound rising from chaos. The rational principle becomes visible in him, and then it sinks again into darkness when he dies. The dead ruler becomes Osiris, linked with drowning and concealment, while the successor rises and becomes Horus, the visible life of the realm. The order of the universe is pictured as alternating between manifest and hidden phases, like day and night, flood and withdrawal, emergence and submergence. This alternating rhythm later takes on specific names. The hidden phase can be linked to a god whose very identity is concealment, a figure associated with what cannot be easily seen or spoken. The manifest phase can be linked to the sun disk, the most obvious symbol of clarity and exposure. At one point in Egyptian history, a dramatic attempt was made to push this clarity to an extreme. A ruler changed his name, moved the capital, and promoted the sun disk as the only true god. The target of his reforms was not simply the number of gods, but the power of hiddenness itself. The aim was to make divine truth as plain as daylight. Art became more naturalistic, and the tone of religion shifted toward blunt visibility. Yet the movement did not last. The older forms returned quickly, and the culture settled back into its long-standing balance. When the first cities appeared, their destruction was also something new. A ruined city is not just a pile of broken walls. It looks like an attack on the very idea of civilization, because early urban life was civilization made visible. Temples, markets, laws, rituals, records, and a shared identity concentrated inside a defended space. Yet the earliest city builders did not treat the fall of a city as a meaningless accident. In Sumer, the world's first great urban culture, the destruction of cities was even counted among the founding principles of civilization itself. Strangely, the next item placed beside it was lamentation, as if ruin and mourning belonged together as part of the same social mechanism. A famous Sumerian poem written after the fall of a major city shows what that mechanism was believed to do. The most devastating consequence of conquest was not only physical damage. The deeper disaster was sacred. The gods were imagined to leave. A city's rights and institutions, once protective and life-giving, were said to become hostile, as though they had been taken over and turned against the people who once served them. In that logic, destroying a city did not mean erasing its civilization. It meant seizing it. The conqueror did not merely smash temples and palaces. The conqueror took the city's standing in the world, its prestige, its divine favor, and the authority that came with them. What looks like barbarism becomes, in this older frame, a form of appropriation. Civilization is captured, not annihilated, and the act of capturing it is treated as one of the forces by which civilization spreads. This invites a broader look at early warfare in the first city-building societies, Mesopotamia and Egypt, and later the urban worlds that rose as the city idea travelled outward, east toward the Indus and west toward the Aegean. In the west, there is an additional advantage. Along with ruins and artifacts, there are epic poems that describe war as remembered and imagined. Tracing war across these early settings can uncover motives that later ages often hide behind politics, economics, and strategy. Some of the oldest impulses may have sunk beneath consciousness, still active, shaping collective behavior, the way buried drives shape a person's life without being fully recognized. In the earliest city cultures, the central motive behind both building and destroying cities appears surprisingly similar. It was the desire to live close to the gods. The first Mesopotamian cities were not primarily commercial hubs, in the modern sense. They were temple communities. They were meant to be divine residences, places where the gods lived among human beings and where human beings could live under direct divine presence. In Egypt, major cities were often tied to creation itself, imagined as sites where the world began or where divine life first took form. To establish a city was not merely to gather people behind walls. It was to stake out a point on the map where heaven touched earth. This helps explain the architecture. Mesopotamian temple towers rose in layered stages, climbing toward a sanctuary at the top. The effect was not subtle. A structure like that does not simply offer a place to worship. It makes a statement about ascent. It suggests a human effort to build upward into the sky. The language of pride surrounding such cities reflects this impulse. Walls are imagined as reaching into clouds. Temples are named as if they were pieces of the heavens brought down into brick and stone. To live in such a place is not merely to be protected by a deity. It is to keep company with a deity, to share space with the powers that govern the world. If a city is believed to be the home of a goddess, then the city's political struggle is never only political. Rivalry over territory and power can become rivalry over divine intimacy. Some early cities did not have permanent kings. In those cases, leadership could be temporary, rising during danger and falling away afterward. But in cities where the king was tied directly to a goddess through sacred partnership, kingship becomes stable and central. A ruler is not only a commander or judge, he is a living link between the population and the divine being who defines the city. In that setting, disputes between cities can take on the shape of competition for the goddess herself. Sometimes the conflict is framed as rival claims to be her true dwelling place. Sometimes it becomes a demand that she be brought from one city to another, as though divine presence can be relocated like a captured treasure. This pattern casts a different light on the West's earliest famous war. The Trojan War is officially explained as a struggle over Helen. Yet there are strong hints that Helen belonged to an older layer of belief in which she was not simply a human figure but a divine one. Even in the epic that portrays her as mortal, the language around her refuses to let her be merely human. Elderly men who should be hardened by politics and war look at her and speak as if they are seeing something beyond ordinary beauty, something almost immortal. A war for such a figure begins to resemble the older idea of war for a goddess, a struggle over access to a divine presence that can elevate a king and his people. Modern eyes often treat sacred marriage as a quaint superstition, a crude attempt to make crops grow through symbolic sex and ritual fertility. But reducing it to agriculture misses its deeper purpose. Sacred union was not simply a trick to control nature. It was the climax of civic intimacy with the gods. If the gods are understood as the forces behind rain, flood, growth, and the turning seasons, then closeness to them naturally suggests fertility and abundance. Yet what seems to be pursued first is not grain alone, but fellowship. The king is meant to tune himself to cosmic rhythms, to place his life in harmony with the larger powers. The city then shares in that harmony by aligning itself with him. The union with the goddess becomes a dramatic public image of a deeper claim, that the city is in resonance with divine life. As history moves forward, the old ambition begins to change shape. The desire to mix with divine powers does not vanish, but it becomes suspect in religious environments that emphasize a single god standing above the world. The old longing is pushed downward, reinterpreted as dangerous, even demonic. Yet the impulse still shows itself in later imagination. The figure of Faust becomes a telling example. A man hungry to cross human limits, willing to bargain with dark powers for higher knowledge and experience, still chasing the ancient dream of becoming godlike. In some versions, the story keeps the fear of damnation, showing desire and terror entwined. In others, The fear weakens and the drive becomes bolder. The longing is no longer simply to taste forbidden pleasure, but to reach an eternal ideal through union with a higher feminine presence. What does such union promise in older myth? One answer appears in the fate imagined for Menelaus, the husband of Helen. He is told that he will not die in the ordinary way, but will be carried to a distant paradise at the edge of the world, where life is effortless and bright. The reason is not his moral merit. It is his marriage link, the fact that his bride is tied to the divine family. The implication is unmistakable. To be joined to a goddess is to be pulled upward into a different category of existence. It is personal immortality by association, and those who support the contender share in it by extension, hoping to participate indirectly in the prize. Yet even this paradise is ambiguous. A perfect land at the world's edge is not the same as endless life at home among one's people. It resembles a beautiful exile, a kind of afterlife in another place, and the older goddess tradition often carries a darker rhythm, descent as well as ascent. There are hints that Helen once belonged to a pattern in which a great female figure periodically passes into death and returns, like Near Eastern goddesses who descend and rise. Stories connected to her worship include images of hanging and death associated with trees and sacred groves. Motifs that echo older myths, where a queen of the dead kills the goddess and demands a substitute. In such a pattern, a goddess's partners can be drawn into her fate, required to share the cost of her passage. Against that background, Homer's portrayal of Helen as human becomes more than a literary choice. It signals a shift in what war is imagined to be about. The object of war becomes fully human, not the capture of divine presence, but the protection of human bonds. The epic world still believes in gods and still imagines them mating with mortals, yet the ideals that justify bloodshed have been changed. Divine ambition is pushed back. Human values take the foreground. War becomes a conflict between households, friendships, and loyalties rather than a contest over sacred possession. This new focus also changes how the gods themselves are perceived. Homer's world repeatedly contrasts immortal life with mortal life, and the difference is brutal. For the gods, war does not carry the same weight. Even when they take sides and fight, the struggle lacks ultimate seriousness, because death does not threaten them in the way it threatens human beings. A god may fear punishment from a higher god, but endless punishment means little to a human being who cannot live long enough to be punished forever. Mortals can be broken only once, and that finality shapes everything. In such a universe, deep partnership between gods and humans becomes difficult. Pity is possible. Help is possible. But true shared life is strained by the gap between endless existence and fragile existence. Alongside this shift comes a change in how the living relate to the dead. Earlier, cultures built heavy, enduring bonds, tombs maintained, rituals repeated, the dead sustained through the attention of descendants. In Homer's epics, the central duty is different. The dead body is burned, the last tie is cut, and the ghost is released to go its own way into the underworld. The living do not keep the dead close, they help the dead leave. The underworld that results is bleak and thin, a shadow world that feels alien to everything valuable in daylight. Death becomes the end of meaningful life, not a doorway into a richer form. The old notion that the dead are divine and the god is dead no longer makes sense in such a worldview. The gods are not immortal because they have crossed death and mastered it. They are immortal simply because they continue while humans must depart. Once hope of divine companionship collapses, the strongest remaining desire is human companionship. the epic becomes crowded with intensely personal attachments. Kings concerned for sons, brothers fighting for brothers, husbands for wives, fathers for children, friends for friends. The emotional core of the war is no longer a city's sacred standing, but a network of private relationships, threatened by violence and loss. In that environment, the overall issue naturally turns into marriage and possession. Not because marriage is trivial, but because it is one of the deepest forms of human bond. Yet this creates a problem. Can human motives alone justify the same scale of destruction once driven by divine ambition? Can a war of 10 years, heavy death, and a city's annihilation be explained by the recovery of a single woman? The epic itself seems uneasy about this. It opens not with a celebration of noble causes, but with the ruin brought by one man's rage. That rage is triggered by a dispute over a captive woman, a prize taken in war. The conflict over her becomes a miniature reflection of the larger war, and its results are grotesquely disproportionate to its cause. Bodies fall, friends die, the battlefield fills with grief, and even a fortified encampment is overrun and partly burned. The smaller conflict looks like an unflattering mirror held up to the larger one, suggesting that behind the grand story there may be something absurd and destructive. The parallel is made explicit in the words given to Achilles. If the war against Troy is justified, because a woman was taken, then anger over a taken captive woman must be equally justified. If vengeance is righteous in one case, it must be righteous in the other. The symmetry is perfect, and that is precisely what makes it disturbing. It forces the listener to confront the possibility that the Great War is not higher than the petty quarrel at all. It may simply be a larger version of the same impulse. Both women in the story are also made to speak in ways that underline the cost. Achilles declares that he will not fight for a girl, and later wishes she had never become the cause of so many deaths. Helen repeatedly wishes she had died before being brought to Troy. And even those who admire her beauty openly fear she will be the ruin of their children. Such statements do not erase the war, but they expose its imbalance. Human beings are being destroyed on a scale that seems too great for the stated reason. Even the construction and destruction of a mock city on the shore intensifies the critique. The Achaeans build walls, towers, gates, and a ditch around their ships, but the structure lacks sacred purpose. There is no deep intention of sharing space with divine presence. Even ritual is neglected. The story portrays the gods as offended, and the wall is eventually destroyed by water after the war, as though the whole project is washed away like a temporary mistake. This shoreline fortification is a pale imitation of a truly sacred city. Its fall becomes a parody of the fall of Troy, and the parody is sharper because the original sacred meaning of city destruction is already slipping away in Homer's world. Troy itself, in the older imagination behind the epic, may not have been merely a fortress for people protected by gods. It may have been conceived as a dwelling shared by gods and humans, a place where divine presence belonged inside the walls. In that earliest layer, a city had to be destroyed in order to force its goddess to depart, to break the bond between the people and the divine power, and to transfer that power to the victors. In Homer's version, that motive is still present, but half forgotten. Helen remains the cause, yet she has been reduced from goddess to woman. And then the story pushes the reduction further by showing another conflict driven by the seizure of a slave girl. The downward movement is clear: goddess, then woman, then captive. The action becomes more vivid and psychologically sharp, yet the old sacred framework has drained away. What remains is a glowing residue, a faint divine afterlight in Helen's link, to Zeus, and a war that now carries the unsettling question of whether human motives alone can bear the weight of such ruin. In the Iliad, the quarrel over a captive woman is treated with an almost exaggerated seriousness, as if it were the same kind of contest that once would have been fought over a goddess. Zeus, the highest divine ruler, steps in and tips the balance between two human kings in a way that feels strangely disproportionate to the cause. Achilles prays to Zeus because he believes a promise has been attached to his life. His years will be few, but his honour will be immense. When Agamemnon humiliates him instead of honouring him, the insult is not simply personal. It becomes an offence against the divine order that is supposed to distribute glory. Once it becomes clear that Achilles' plea has been answered and the Achaean side begins to suffer, Agamemnon reads the disaster as a verdict. The man favoured by Zeus, he admits, outweighs thousands. By dishonouring the one Zeus honours, Agamemnon has undermined his own authority, because a king's legitimacy depends on acting as the visible hand of divine will. This realization drives Agamemnon to an extreme attempt at repair. He offers not only the return of Briseis, but also a marriage alliance, promising his own daughter as a bride. The proposal is more than an apology. It is a bid to recover the sacred shape of kingship, as if marriage could restore a broken chain between ruler and divine approval. Achilles' refusal matters for the same reason. Accepting would allow Agamemnon to re-enter the role of the rightful divine representative. Refusing keeps him stripped of that position. Only later, when Achilles reconciles, does Agamemnon regain confidence that the world's higher will is no longer against him, and success begins to return. Behind these events stands an image that appears across several early cultures: the god who holds the instruments of destiny. Zeus is described as possessing golden scales, used to weigh fates, much as the supreme gods of Mesopotamia are imagined to possess tablets that define what must happen. Modern eyes might see such symbols and conclude that destiny is an impersonal force, something even Zeus must obey. A balance can look like blind justice, a mechanism rather than a choice. Yet the older meaning may be different. The point may not be that fate exists above the gods, but that divine decisions are not made by human reasoning. In this view, everything that is contingent is decided by choice, but not all choices belong to human beings. Humans can choose to go to war or to seek peace. They cannot choose victory or defeat. Those outcomes are treated as belonging to a higher chooser. The scales and the casting of lots signal independence from human control, not submission to an impersonal law. Still, something shifts as the epic tradition evolves. When the purpose of war loses its older sacred logic, the outcomes begin to feel empty as well. If conflict has sunk from a struggle over a goddess into a fight over a woman, and then into a feud over a slave, the grandeur of destiny begins to look less like wisdom and more like randomness. It is not that Zeus stops choosing, it is that the choices begin to look arbitrary. The Iliad itself shows this tension. Zeus uses the scales at key moments, first, to let one side rise and the other fall, and later to mark the turning point, where Hector's fate sinks and Achilles' rises. The stated aim is straightforward. Achilles must receive glory. The will behind events remains personal and free. The doubt is not whether someone is choosing. The doubt is whether the choosing has any depth, whether the will shaping the slaughter has anything that deserves to be called wisdom. And because the pointlessness of outcomes reflects the pointlessness of the war itself, the doubt extends downward as well, toward human judgment and the reasons men give for destruction. That uncertainty is one reason early societies relied on councils. Kings were imagined to decide whether to propose war or peace, but they were not thought to control the hidden chain of consequences. For that, rulers needed advisors whose task was to anticipate what would follow from any decision. Across Indo-European societies and also in the Near Eastern city cultures, there appears again and again the same political structure. A king supported by a gathering of elders, a council of experienced men whose job is to warn, restrain, or guide. Even in Egypt, where royal authority could be described in almost divine terms, there remained formal assemblies of nobles and great men, though these often functioned more as a stage on which royal boldness could be dramatized against cautious advice. In the more fragmented world of early Mesopotamia, where city-states competed and kingship could be more exposed to civic pressure, the council's voice could matter more sharply. A king might still ignore it, but the risk would be his. In practice, these advisors were trying to do something close to an impossible calculation. They were trying to estimate destiny. Many ancient traditions treat fate as conditional. A city may face different possible futures depending on what it chooses. A ruler might be offered a choice between a long life without renown and a short life with lasting glory. Yet even this common pattern contains a problem. Outcomes are not fixed in the way a simple equation is fixed. They depend on the moves of opponents, on shifting alliances, on accidents and weather, on morale and disease. Predicting a result is more like playing a complex strategy game than reading a single script. If a fixed outcome is assigned to each possible decision, that assumption already belongs to a doctrine of fate. Even so, a doctrine like this can still leave room for human freedom, because freedom lies in the ability to choose among possible paths, even when each path is imagined to carry its own predetermined end. A council that claims insight into this web of possibilities naturally begins to resemble something more than a group of old men. Wisdom about destiny makes advisors seem godlike, because destiny itself is imagined as something arranged in divine deliberation. Many mythologies place the gods in council, sitting together to distribute the lots of humans. The number varies, but the structure repeats, a small assembly that mirrors the human assembly. In Mesopotamian stories, a compact group of major deities determines fates. In Egypt, a larger divine circle gathers around the king of the gods. In Indo-European worlds, divine councils often appear in patterns that echo human political arrangements. This is not only a matter of people imagining heaven as a copy of Earth. It is also a wish to participate through human institutions in the kind of deliberation believed to govern the universe. From that desire, another step follows naturally. Judgment moves from the gods into human hands. Earlier methods such as ordeal and duel treat the gods as direct judges, showing the truth through fire, water, or combat. But councils of elders gradually take over the judging role themselves, creating courts where humans decide the fate of humans. The same institution that advises the king also becomes the highest legal authority. A council, sitting in a circle, holding staffs of office, listening to arguments, awarding the prize for the best judgment, appears in epic description like a civic ritual of justice. The scene is not presented as mere administration. It looks like the human imitation of divine judgment. This is also why ancient imagination links courts with the underworld. If the dead are judged by divine powers, and if fate is decreed by divine powers, then earthly judgment begins to look like a joint session between living elders and unseen gods. In some Mesopotamian traditions, the underworld court is imagined as issuing death sentences, carried out by a messenger of the Queen of the Dead. In Egyptian tradition, the underworld court decides whether death ends in annihilation or continues into a blessed afterlife. The forms differ, but the symbolic bridge remains. judges on earth and judges beyond the grave operate on the same moral axis. In extreme cases, punishment is not only execution, but erasure, the removal of a name so that a person is cut off from memory as well as life. Once such ideas take hold, the boundary between consulting gods and consulting the dead becomes thin. If the dead can be imagined as divine in the underworld, and if divine beings can be imagined as linked with that realm, then seeking knowledge of the future might turn in two directions that are essentially the same. A king who cannot get an answer through omens or priests might try to force an answer through the dead. A figure called up from the earth can be described as godlike. Divination and necromancy become twin techniques aimed at one goal, peering into the outcomes that lie beyond human control. Yet the Iliad also carries a quiet suspicion about all of this. The epic does not deny the gods, it doubts their reliability. It shows gods deceiving mortals, guiding them into traps, clouding their judgment, and steering them toward ruin. Later, philosophers were disturbed by precisely this portrayal, because it makes divine beings look unworthy of reverence. A defense exists in which the gods claim humans bring suffering on themselves through their own blindness. But even that defense is unstable if blindness itself can be sent by divine hands. There is also a practical reason for mistrust. For a side that loses a battle despite believing it has acted correctly, the gods look neither good nor truthful. And deception can even appear necessary for fate to succeed. If a city is destined to fall, and if its leaders know the future clearly, then they might choose the one action that prevents the destined end: surrender. In that case, the destruction would never happen. So the story world allows the gods to interfere, not only by granting strength, but by blocking settlement, disrupting agreements, and turning moments of possible peace into renewed conflict. A duel that might end a war is prevented from ending it. The puzzle is why people continue to consult powers they suspect may lie. The answer is that complete rational prediction is impossible. Human action triggers chains of consequence that depend on other human choices and on chance. Yet decisions must still be made, and the cost of being wrong can be catastrophic, so calculation moves as far as it can, weighing risks, comparing likely outcomes, estimating odds. And when calculation reaches its limit, the decision often collapses into a random device. A coin toss, dice, lots, any method that breaks the deadlock when no rational criterion remains. Ancient divination often worked the same way, especially when it used lots as a direct method. The difference between the modern person who flips a coin after exhausting analysis and the ancient person who draws lots before an altar is narrower than it first appears. In both cases, the decisive step happens at the edge of knowledge, where reason has been used as far as it can go and the future still refuses to become clear. In Homer's world, the gods do not simply watch human beings act. They lean into human emotions, using anger, pride, and desire as tools, often steering events toward ends that have little to do with what the people involved think they are pursuing. That is why reliance on omens and oracles is treated with caution. Practical judgment can still measure what is possible, what is likely, and what risks are obvious, even if it cannot predict which of several outcomes will actually happen. Only after reason reaches its limit does a person step into the darker zone, where divine interference might decide what chance and opposition leave uncertain. Trusting what cannot be trusted is avoided as long as there is any alternative. Even so, excuses remain available after disaster. A leader can say the gods blinded him, and Homer's heroes often speak that way. But the gods, in Homer's stories, answer back with a different accusation. The signs were there, and a human mind should have seen them. In other words, the boundary between divine deception and human failure is deliberately blurred. A man can be led astray, but he can also be blamed for not using the judgment that was already within reach. This is where the council becomes crucial. In Homeric thinking, the council exists to prevent that kind of ruinous blindness. A pattern is described as if it were almost a law of human life. Blindness leads to catastrophe. Afterward come appeals and pleas that might repair the damage. If those pleas are rejected, then the ruin is allowed to run its full course. The moral is pointed. When a king collapses into disaster, it is usually because he refused to listen when wiser voices warned him. The council is meant to slow down passion, to force a pause, to make the obvious costs visible before pride and rage lock a decision in place. There is a distant resemblance here to a later philosophical idea, sometimes called the cunning, that moves through history. In both views, raw passions drive events, and outcomes often contradict the intentions of the people acting. A larger purpose seems to emerge through the collision of private aims. But the similarity is limited. In the later philosophy, the larger purpose is universal and slowly gathers human life into bigger forms. So private ambitions unintentionally serve something broader than themselves. In Homer, the larger purpose does not look universal or uplifting. It looks narrow, particular, almost petty. The war does not unfold as a grand national awakening. It unfolds toward a single outcome that seems fixed in advance. One city is to fall after years of struggle, and the fall will be paid for with a long harvest of deaths on both sides. If that is how the world works, then no sweeping science of history can rescue anyone. Only practical wisdom can. The kind of intelligence Homer respects is not mystical prophecy and not mathematical prediction. It is the ability to look forward by remembering what has already happened. The ideal counselor is praised as someone who can see in two directions, not by supernatural sight, but by experience. What happened before, what usually follows when certain choices are made, and what cost is likely to be demanded. When leaders speak of having destroyed cities in the past and of destroying more in the future, they are drawing a crude map of hindsight and foresight at once. Cities have fallen before. They will fall again. And the question is always how much blood will be spent to reach the end. And yet, even in that hard-headed language, suspicion creeps in. Homer repeatedly lets characters voice the fear that the gods have misled them, offering confidence while hiding the real price. At times, this doubt is theatrical, used by a leader to test whether his men still have the will to fight. Later, it becomes sincere when losses pile up. A false dream can push an army into battle with the belief that victory is immediate, and the resulting slaughter can make that army feel abandoned by the very powers it thought were guiding it. In Homer's telling, the final outcome may still arrive as expected, but the path is designed to be cruel. The besiegers do not achieve what they wanted, which was victory at minimal cost. The defenders do not achieve what they wanted, which was survival. The gods' purpose, if it can be called that, looks like the harsh middle that results from two opposing wills grinding against each other. The city is taken, but the attackers pay as heavily as possible for taking it. This is why deception feels built into war. A struggle cannot satisfy both sides, and even satisfying one side fully is almost impossible once resistance exists. If everyone clearly understood that the desired objective cannot be reached without resistance reshaping it, then the entire meaning of war would have to change. Without some naive hope of clean success, people would either refuse war entirely or fight for a goal other than victory itself. In Homer's eyes, war requires blindness, the way a fire requires fuel. The Iliad's central dispute, the rage of Achilles against Agamemnon over a captive woman, becomes a concentrated demonstration of this logic. One leader believes he can insult a crucial ally without consequences. The other believes he can withdraw from the fight without consequences. Both beliefs collapse. Agamemnon's army bleeds and stumbles. Achilles loses what he values most. In each case, the disaster is tied to refusal of counsel. Warnings were given. Appeals were made. They were rejected until shock forced a change. Only after damage has been done do the two men become willing to listen and to bend. The grim comedy, if it is meant as comedy, lies in the mismatch between cause and cost. A quarrel about possession escalates into widespread death. The same mismatch hangs over the wider war. A conflict that consumes years and destroys a city is linked to the taking and keeping of a single woman. People inside the story even say it aloud, wishing the whole chain of suffering had never begun. The absurdity becomes clear only after the consequences arrive, when it is too late to unspend the blood already poured into the ground. It might seem that the gods, who supposedly know the future, would never suffer from anything resembling blindness. Yet Homer includes a scene that cuts against that expectation. Zeus himself can be distracted, trapped by desire, and temporarily outmaneuvered by another god's scheme. The episode does not permanently overturn Zeus's will, but it exposes something important. Divine life in the epic is not presented as perfectly rational or serenely wise. The gods act like powerful persons with rivalries, appetites, and grudges. That reinforces the impression that a higher purpose in this world is not necessarily meaningful. When outcomes feel senseless, it becomes tempting to interpret them as the product of pure chance. If gods exist, that same senselessness can be reimagined as divine blindness or divine trickery. The effect on human beings is similar, a world where plans fail for reasons no one can fully predict. Consent to war in this framework becomes a complicated thing. People do not accept war because it looks good. They accept it because peace carries its own threats and humiliations, and sometimes those threats feel nearly as unbearable as battle. A story from the Sumerian world captures the logic. An outside power demands submission and labor service. The elders advise acceptance to avoid endangering the city. The assembly of fighting men prefers war, not because they love hardship, but because submission looks like endless obligation and loss of dignity, while war looks like a single dangerous gamble that might end the pressure. The decision is made in the shadow of two evils. War is chosen because it promises a shorter suffering than the slow squeeze of enforced obedience. But that is not enough by itself. People also need hope. They are far more likely to consent when they believe victory is possible, and more than that, when they believe the gods can decisively favour one side. Under that belief, something remarkable becomes possible. A war can end without mass killing, not through compromise but through surrender triggered by a sudden conviction that the opposing side has divine backing. A leader appears, confidence collapses, and an army breaks psychologically. The conflict ends because the losing side believes it has seen the sign that matters most. The myths and legends of early city warfare often carry this possibility. The gods choose, the evidence is recognized, and capitulation follows. Homer's world does not allow that simplicity. The gods can be split. Some support one side, some support the other, and their favor can shift. Under those conditions, an early defeat does not settle anything. It becomes merely one moment in a long contest, because tomorrow might belong to a different divine wind. Even the idea of settling the war by a duel between champions loses its force if divine support is not expected to be unified and final. A duel becomes only another episode, not a revelation that binds everyone's will. And if the gods themselves can interrupt agreements, disrupt oaths, and push people back into fighting, then even clear outcomes can be made unclear. This leads to a strange truth about war. Much of what counts as victory depends on shared belief. If a people accepts the idea that defeat in a formal battle settles the question, then defeat settles the question. If they refuse that idea, then a battlefield loss can become a mere gesture with little power to end the struggle. What matters is the political mythology that tells people what a defeat means. Rejecting the old myth does not automatically produce realism. It may simply replace one myth with another, a different source of hope, perhaps luck, perhaps destiny, perhaps history's supposed direction. In Homer, the cause of war no longer carries enough sacred weight to justify endless sacrifice on its own. Neither side can claim an unquestionable divine mandate. As the months stretch into years, fatigue grows and the desire to quit rises. Then hope is summoned again, sometimes by signs, sometimes by remembered omens, sometimes by speeches that revive the belief that fortune can turn overnight. Spoils, captive prizes, and personal glory are not deep reasons by themselves, but they become powerful when combined with the renewed expectation of victory. When the cause is not holy enough to sustain devotion, the promise of reward and the possibility of sudden success do the work. This does not mean people value power more than life. It means they imagine a richer life. They gamble because they believe death is only a risk, not a certainty, and because they believe the gamble can increase the weight of their existence. Even heroes who seem to accept fate do not embrace death with serene love. When they die, they lament. When things go wrong, they argue with the gods. Acceptance is not calm surrender, it is endurance under pressure, and the sharpest irony appears at the level of followers. Leaders cling to pride and pursue objectives without clearly seeing the true cost. The men who follow often see more clearly, complain more openly, and still go along. They do not want the full disaster that will result, yet they are caught inside the leader's quarrel and share its consequences. The Trojans may hate the decision that keeps Helen within their walls, yet they remain, and they lose everything. The Achaean army may resent the insult that pushes Achilles away from the fight, yet they still fight on, and many die in the gap created by their leader's stubbornness. The people consent, but they do not consent to the ruin that follows. Even among the gods, unity is reluctant. Zeus restrains the gods from helping, then later allows them to enter the battle on whichever side they choose. The divine world mirrors the human one. Divided loyalties, reluctant compromises, shifting permission. The result is that nothing in the war carries wholehearted approval. The fighters do not love what they are doing. The gods do not fully endorse what happens. The outcome arrives as something neither side wanted in its pure form, and something that even the divine rulers do not embrace without hesitation. This is why Homer's view of war feels like a warning. The old kind of warfare was imagined as serving a sacred aim, tied to divine ownership, divine favour, divine transfer of what was holy from one place to another. Later, warfare becomes about more ordinary human goals. And yet, it still demands the same terrifying price. Some modern thinkers imagine that limiting war to purely earthly objectives will make it saner and safer. Homer's darker suggestion is that this shift does not automatically cure the madness. It may simply create a different kind of madness. Wars fought for smaller reasons, with the same destructive force, sustained by hope, miscalculation, and the stubborn blindness that only catastrophe finally corrects. When civilization first took shape, people did not yet seem convinced that human possibilities had firm limits. If they had believed from the beginning that those limits were immovable, it is hard to imagine why they would ever have embarked on the daring project of trying to live like the gods. Yet signs appear very early that this confidence began to crack. The Epic of Gilgamesh already tells the story of a man who searches for a way to prolong life without end, and fails. That story could only have resonated if the desire it expressed was still vivid and the disappointment still close at hand. The longing itself never disappears. It surfaces again and again across history, sometimes openly, sometimes in new forms, even in modern ideals that dream of overcoming ordinary human constraints. Alongside this ancient story stands another epic that found just as strong an audience and left an equally long shadow. It tells almost the opposite tale. Odysseus is offered immortality by a goddess and refuses it. He does not rush toward eternal life, but instead spends years struggling to return home. He travels just as far and suffers just as much as Gilgamesh, but his direction is reversed. One hero moves outward toward a garden beyond the world, the other circles endlessly back toward a familiar shore. What seems to have weakened the original dream of living among the gods was the gradual acceptance in early city cultures that there is something in human beings that sets boundaries. A person may strive, achieve, and endure, but there are points beyond which striving turns into frustration. Before this idea could take hold, it had to be lived through. Gilgamesh's failure gives shape to that experience. Only after such failure could a different attitude emerge. One that no longer aims at endless life, but instead tries to use fully the limited span that is available. Later ages tried repeatedly to undo this acceptance. To keep alive the hope of divine status, it became necessary either to deny that there is such a thing as a fixed human nature or to claim that humanity is infinitely adaptable and perfectible. These ideas reappear whenever limits feel unbearable. Yet every renewed attempt to cross those limits runs into the same barrier, above all the certainty of death. And that barrier almost always brings the idea of human nature back into view. Whether that idea is valid depends on two contrasting experiences that ancient stories place side by side. One is the frustration embodied by Gilgamesh. The other is the deliberate withdrawal embodied by Odysseus. If both experiences ring true, then the idea of limits seems grounded in reality. If they can be dismissed as illusions, then the dream of perfectibility remains open. In several Near Eastern legends, a mortal refuses an offer of immortality. But the motive is not the same as in the Odyssey. Odysseus explains his refusal in simple terms: longing for home. He does not speak in abstract language about limits or destiny. He speaks of returning, of reaching the day when he will once again stand on his own land. The goddess who offers him eternal life cannot understand this choice. From her point of view, a mortal wife and a fragile household cannot compete with a deathless existence. From his point of view, immortality without belonging would mean endless unhappiness. A short life filled with familiar joy seems preferable to an eternal life spent in isolation, however splendid that isolation might appear from the outside. In Near Eastern versions of similar encounters, the refusal carries a sharper edge. The mortal does not simply say he prefers home. He accuses the goddess of deception. Eternal life, he insists, is not something a human being can truly receive. Aging and death await everyone. The question is not whether immortality is desirable, but whether it is even possible. The unspoken assumption is that living forever would require ceasing to be human, crossing over into a different order of being altogether. Greek mythology largely shares this assumption. A mortal can become immortal only by abandoning humanity, and that abandonment comes at a price. The Greeks add another layer to the problem. Whatever happiness belongs to the gods is not the same as human happiness. Immortality can turn into a trap. Stories circulate of figures who live forever but do so in a state of endless decline or stagnation. Watching youth and vitality drain away, while existence continues without release. Eternal life, stripped of human measure, can become a refined form of misery. It is tempting to suspect that this rejection of immortality is merely a way of coping with disappointment, a way of dismissing what cannot be had. The heroes who speak most eloquently about the burdens of immortality are not, after all, offered a real chance to accept it. The tone of calm acceptance may belong to a later stage, when the shock of failure has settled and the mind seeks reconciliation. Earlier myths, especially in the Near East, are more direct in their sense of loss, even when they already hint that joy belongs to the earthly world rather than to the heavens. Greek tradition itself preserves traces of this earlier attitude. The labours of Heracles include a clear attempt to obtain something that would prolong life without end. His failure mirrors that of Gilgamesh. The later attitude found in the Odyssey seems to arise only after such efforts have been exhausted and abandoned. By that point, the heroic imagination no longer looks for escape from mortality, but turns toward making peace with it. In both Gilgamesh and Heracles, death is linked to divine hostility. The hero's striving provokes a goddess, and her anger closes the path. What these figures seek is not a shadowy afterlife, but an unbroken continuation of life in their own world. They want to bring renewal back home, not to disappear into a distant paradise. Their failure does not disprove the hope of some existence after death. But it does shatter the more ambitious dream of avoiding death altogether. Once that dream collapses, only one course remains: to accept the finite span of life and try to fill it as fully as possible. This shift does not actually change the deepest desire. At every stage, the underlying wish is the same: to live here, in this world. At first, it seemed possible to live on through others after death. Later, it seemed possible to prevent death itself. Finally, when both hopes failed, attention turned to intensifying the brief time available. Odysseus's refusal of immortality does not come from a love of death or indifference toward it. On the contrary, death fills him with dread. When he is told that he must speak with the dead in order to learn his fate, he recoils in fear. Acceptance comes only when resistance is useless. The thought expressed by Achilles after death, that the poorest life is better than kingship among the dead, captures the same feeling. Death is hated because it tears a person away from everything familiar. It destroys the very conditions that make life worth living. From this perspective, rejecting immortality and fearing death are not contradictions. Both arise from the same attachment to ordinary human life. Immortality offered in a strange place by an inhuman being is rejected for the same reason death is feared. Both threaten home, relationships, and continuity. Even when death is described as gentle and delayed, it remains something to be endured, not welcomed. Modern interpretations sometimes reverse this valuation. They suggest that truly honest existence begins only when one lives in constant awareness of death, stripped of comforting familiarity. By that standard, the life Odysseus longs for would be dismissed as self-deception. Yet in the Odyssey, ordinary life is not cheap or automatic. It is something painfully regained. The wandering through strange lands is not celebrated as authenticity, but endured as exile. The extraordinary life is forced on the hero. The ordinary life is what he works to recover. The story ends once that recovery is complete, not because the hero's goal is trivial, but because fulfillment needs no embellishment. To criticize Odysseus for seeking quiet happiness would require assuming that a life is valuable only if it produces spectacle. The poem does not make that assumption. If there is a critique within the story, it lies elsewhere. The happiness Odysseus finally attains is small compared with the suffering required to reach it. He himself acknowledges this imbalance. He knows that if all future hardships were laid out in advance, the journey might not seem worth it. He has already paid so much that adding more pain feels unavoidable. The curse laid on his return ensures that the goal is reached only after extreme loss. Happiness arrives, but it arrives late and diminished. The appeal of the Odyssey can easily mislead. The audience delights in the adventures and forgets that the hero experiences them as misery. The pleasure of hearing the tale is not the same as the experience of living it. Recognizing this difference is essential. The story is designed to be enjoyed from a place of safety, from a hall or a home, not to present wandering itself as desirable. Odysseus's route through the world of marvels has a clear internal order. Each stop is another barrier between him and one final destination. In that sense, his journey resembles the older heroic patterns. Gilgamesh and Heracles also move from trial to trial, and each encounter tests whether the hero can stay on course. Yet there is a difference that changes the whole atmosphere. Gilgamesh and Heracles are expected to leave ordinary roads behind, because they are chasing something extraordinary. A garden at the edge of the world, a source of renewed life, a treasure that defies death. Those goals almost demand a path that breaks away from common experience. Odysseus, by contrast, is trying to return to something ordinary. Home is not meant to be beyond the horizon of reality. So the farther he is dragged from it, the more the whole chain of obstacles begins to feel strangely excessive. Trials that seem natural on a road to paradise begin to look arbitrary on a road to Ithaca. The effect is similar to what happens when a war once framed in divine terms becomes a war over something merely human. The structure remains, but the sense of proportion collapses. This loss of proportion helps explain why the theme of blindness sits so close to the center of the Odyssey, just as it does in the Iliad. The story repeatedly shows people acting as though they cannot see what their own situation should make obvious. Odysseus himself brings disaster on his return by taunting the Cyclops, a reckless gesture that turns a narrow escape into a long curse. His companions repeat the pattern when they eat what they have been warned not to touch, choosing a momentary satisfaction over the one thing that matters, the journey home. Then, back in Ithaca, the suitors behave as if Odysseus is a rumour that will never solidify into a living presence. They build their plans on the assumption that the king is gone for good, and that assumption becomes the trap that closes on them. Each instance of blindness produces a different wound. The insult to the Cyclops explains why the homecoming becomes slow and punishing. The cattle of the sun explain why Odysseus reaches home alone. The suitor's arrogance explains why home is no longer peace when he arrives, but another crisis waiting at the threshold. The pattern resembles the mutual self-deception that drives the Trojan War forward. Human error keeps the machine running, and the cost rises far beyond what the actors imagined when they began. Over this human blindness hangs another unsettling layer. The conduct of the gods often looks unpredictable, even capricious. They punish impulsive words, they enforce sacred rules with extreme consequences, they permit suffering to stretch across years. In the Iliad, that harshness is tied to a deeper shift in meaning. The war once belonged to a religious world, shaped by the idea that cities were bound to their gods and that victory could mean seizing a divine presence. When that older sacred aim dissolves, the violence still continues, but it begins to look senseless. In the Odyssey, the emptiness comes from a different loss. It is not the collapse of an afterlife ideal that dominates the mood, but the fading of a later hope. The hope that death itself might be outwitted in this world. If a culture once imagined that the gift of the gods could be gained, either continued participation beyond death, or some kind of life that does not end, then repeated failure changes the emotional climate. What remains is the task of living within limits. The dream of living in close contact with divine power, whether as fellowship with the dead or as endless life on earth, does not vanish because one particular attempt fails. One failed search for a life-giving plant does not logically prove that no such plant can exist. Just as one failed method of preserving a body does not prove that no afterlife is possible. But failure has a different effect than proof. It forces recognition. It teaches that human efforts, no matter how courageous, arrive at boundaries. That recognition is the seed of what later gets called human nature, understood in the most minimal and sober way. Not as a list of fixed traits, but as the presence of a limit built into the human condition. As long as that insight is kept modest, it is hard to deny. It does not say what a person must become in every detail. It says only that what a person can accomplish through personal effort will always be finite. Once that is accepted, several conclusions follow almost automatically. The first is that the desire for immortality becomes dangerous when it hardens into an expectation, because it invites a life spent chasing something the seeker cannot reach by ordinary means. The second is that attention should shift toward what is possible, using the given span well, squeezing meaning and joy out of a bounded life, reaching as far as the boundary allows without pretending the boundary is not there. Yet the Homeric epics themselves complicate this neat solution. The Iliad and the Odyssey reveal a strong sense of futility, even when the goal is no longer immortality. Fighting for years, bleeding for prizes that shrink in significance, wandering through a maze of dangers, just to stand again on one's own soil. These stories often feel like portraits of human existence as a struggle to gain a small portion of happiness at an enormous price. That mood raises an uncomfortable question. If the sensible response to limits is simply to make the most of the finite, why do these poems, which in many ways accept finitude, still carry such a heavy undertone of absurdity? One answer would be that the poems are not condemning finite life itself, but only certain kinds of actions that belong to older, outdated hopes. Battles and wanderings that once made sense as steps toward divine life become misplaced when the divine goal is abandoned. In this view, the lesson is practical. Remove the misplaced behaviors, and ordinary life can still be meaningful. But Homer's world does not allow such clean editing. Circumstances force people into war. Circumstances force people into exile, into loss, into harsh choices. Even a man who wants nothing more than a quiet life may be driven into violence to protect his home, or into suffering to regain it. The absurd is not always chosen. Often it is endured as the entrance fee for whatever limited happiness remains. That is why the sense of futility in these epics matters. It would not exist at all if there were no hunger for meaning behind it. The pain of pointlessness is the shadow cast by a demand that life should make sense. If the proud decision to live as a human being, refusing divine bargains, rejecting the fantasy of becoming more than mortal, is not simply a disguised form of disappointment, then the demand cannot be ignored. Something must answer it. The poems do not offer an easy solution, but they do make one thing clear. Once the old dreams collapse, the problem is not merely how to accept limits, but how to find a meaning strong enough to justify the cost of living within them. Even for someone who believes that life ends completely at death, with no clear afterlife beyond a faint shadow, there is another path that once promised a form of immortality. This path does not rely only on personal survival or divine reward. It begins with the familiar idea of lasting fame, but it goes much further than remembrance preserved in human memory. At At its strongest, it rests on the conviction that the past itself does not perish. What has truly happened, once it has taken place, cannot be undone. In this sense, the past is unchanging. And precisely because it is unchanging, it possesses a kind of immortality. In the Homeric epics, the desire for lasting renown already plays an important role. Yet Homer constantly contrasts mortal humans with immortal gods, tragic human existence with the carefree existence of the divine. As long as immortality was imagined primarily as endless future life, like that enjoyed by the gods, it was difficult to shift attention toward the idea of an undying past. Only when the hope of sharing life with the gods faded and kingship itself declined, did another solution gradually emerge. If immortality could no longer be found in the future, perhaps it could be found in what had already been accomplished. The result was a new vision of permanence. Not a society destined to last forever, but a society whose past could never be erased. The city became eternal not through its future, but through its history. This outlook did not vanish with antiquity. It reappeared again and again during later revivals of classical culture, and still stands as an alternative to modern ideologies that imagine the past as something that can be abolished or overwritten. Its most refined and influential expression, however, appeared during the brief period when Athens stood at the height of its power. To understand the strength and limits of this idea, that moment deserves close attention. In earlier ages, the destruction of a city carried an almost cosmic meaning, because the city was thought to be sacred ground where gods and humans met. In Republican times, cities were still destroyed, but the meaning of that destruction changed. During the Persian invasion, Athens was evacuated and burned, yet the Athenians did not consider their city to have ceased to exist. Themistocles famously responded to mockery by declaring that Athens remained a city as long as it possessed its fleet and its people. He even threatened to move the entire city overseas if the Greeks refused to fight at sea. Such statements would have been unthinkable in an age when a city was inseparable from a specific holy place. What made this even more striking was that Athenians prided themselves on having lived on the same land from the very beginning. Even so, they had reached the point where the city could be imagined apart from its soil. A city that could exist aboard ships or be transplanted elsewhere was very different from the ancient city believed to stand at the centre of the world. This shift did not yet amount to a complete rejection of sacred space, but it clearly anticipated a later view in which human location in the universe would be considered insignificant. Already in the Republican period, a new slogan expressed the change. A city is made of people, not walls. Sparta embodied this principle in its own way. Unlike the fortified citadels of the Bronze Age, classical Sparta had no walls for centuries. It relied entirely on the discipline and courage of its citizens. Tradition attributed to its lawgiver the claim that a city is best defended by brave men rather than stone. The settlement itself was little more than a cluster of villages, and its territory lacked unity. Only much later did Sparta surround itself with walls again. The city's strength was not meant to be visible in architecture, but embodied in its people. Athens demonstrated the same principle through endurance rather than austerity. Even after repeated destruction, Athenians believed their city survived as long as its citizens survived. Writers of the time expressed this clearly. The city was safe as long as its people existed. Ships, walls, temples, and statues were secondary. When Athens later became wealthy and adorned itself with magnificent buildings, its leaders still insisted that these were not essential. In times of crisis, even sacred objects could be stripped of their material value to support the common cause. This attitude marked a clear break from the older world, where shrines and divine images were thought to guarantee a city's survival. Earlier legends insisted that Troy could not fall until its sacred image was stolen. By Republican times, such beliefs had lost their force. Gods remained, but their presence no longer defined the city in the same way. What endured was not a divine object, but a human community. Between the sacred city of early kingship and the later city as pure community stood an intermediate idea: the city as homeland. At this stage, the city was still primarily a place, but it was increasingly understood as a place where humans lived, rather than where gods dwelled among humans. The king was no longer the divine consort of a goddess, but the foremost resident of the city. His palace became the principal household rather than a sanctuary. From here, it was a short step to the idea that the king was simply one citizen among others, and eventually to the conviction that he could be replaced or removed. This development shaped later political thought. Philosophers began to explain the city not as a sacred location, but as a human association. They traced its origins to families and households, imagining cities as growing out of smaller communities. Yet, this explanation likely reversed the true order of things. Families had always existed within larger social frameworks, and their form changed as the city changed. When the city ceased to be primarily a place, the household itself became portable. Homes could be moved, just as cities could. Communities replaced fixed locations. This growing independence from place raises a deeper question. In modern times, detachment from place has often been criticized as alienation, a loss of rooted existence. Yet in the ancient republics, this shift was not seen as a loss, but as a gain. It was understood as a form of transcendence. Human life was no longer bound to one sacred spot. The city existed wherever its people existed. Philosophical criticism in this period did not reject this development. On the contrary, it carried it further. Plato moved beyond the idea of a city independent of place to the idea of a city that existed nowhere at all. His ideal city was not located on Earth. It transcended every particular city. This way of thinking became possible only after the city had already been reconceived as a human community rather than a sacred place. It would be misleading to treat Plato's ideal city as a practical blueprint. For him, it was an ideal standard, not a plan meant to be realized. Actual cities could be measured against it, improved by it, but never fully embody it. His criticism of existing cities focused on motivation, education, social structure, and forms of rule. His proposals aimed at shaping citizens who approximated the good as closely as possible. Comedy had already mocked many of the same failings Plato criticized seriously. Plays imagined escape from flawed cities into fantastic ones. Plato shared the dissatisfaction, but sought something beyond satire. He believed that beneath stories and myths lay a deeper truth, an ideal reality that could be approached through philosophy. The political reforms he proposed were radical, not because they abolished order, but because they aimed to eliminate every standard except goodness itself. Property, birth, and gender were to matter less than moral and intellectual quality. This was not a rejection of the city as community, but an attempt to redefine what that community should honour. At the height of Athens' power, the idea of the eternal city reached its most confident expression. Facing war, plague, and death, leaders asked whether the fallen had died in vain and whether the city would disappear. The answer given was striking. Even if the city declined, even if its empire collapsed, its greatness could never be undone. What had been achieved would remain forever. This claim to eternity did not depend on future survival. It rested on the conviction that the past itself was permanent. Later, empires would make similar claims, sometimes imagining endless future dominion. Yet even ancient thinkers often acknowledged that cities could fall. Their confidence lay elsewhere. What had once been achieved could not be erased. Modern societies rarely speak this way. Faced with decline, they tend to focus on what must still be achieved. Ancient republics focused instead on what had already been done. For them, a worthy cause gave meaning to death regardless of outcome. Victory mattered less than the nobility of the deed. This difference shaped their understanding of freedom. Freedom was not primarily self-expression or future potential. It was participation in a living past. To act courageously was to inscribe oneself into history. To fail to act was to remain a non-entity. Law itself was valued because it preserved continuity. It bound present action to past deeds. Tyranny was hated not simply because it brought suffering, but because it severed a city from its own past. Even prosperity under a tyrant could feel like misery if it came at the price of historical identity. Freedom meant belonging to a story that could not be undone. From this perspective, the past was immortal by its very nature, but not everyone shared in it. Only those who acted, who created deeds worth remembering, truly belonged to it. If immortality lay in the past, then even life itself could be sacrificed for it. This idea could not be refuted by events alone. A city might fall, yet its past would remain. Only a new way of thinking about time could challenge it. Such a challenge emerged when time itself was distinguished from eternity. If time flows and passes away, then the past cannot remain in the same way eternity does. Under this view, only an ideal realm stands outside time. Yet even here, traces of the older belief remained. Early philosophy often looked backward rather than forward. It sought origins. It treated wisdom as recovery rather than invention. Some thinkers even claimed to remember earlier lives. Knowledge itself was described as recollection. Over time, philosophy shifted from uncovering the past to contemplating timeless truths. The past became material for myth and symbol. Historical events were no longer simply facts, but images pointing beyond themselves. Figures like Socrates became examples of this transformation. His life was treated not as a sequence of events to be undone or corrected, but as a revelation of enduring meaning. In tragedy, the unchangeable past often led to despair. In later thought, knowledge transformed that despair into acceptance. The noble life gained value not because it could change the past, but because it stood firm before it. Ultimately, the ancient search for immortality moved from gods to future life, to the past, and finally to the realm of timeless truth. In that final step, immortality was no longer something to be possessed, but something to be contemplated. Plato once claimed that human societies would know no real peace until those who govern also pursue wisdom, or until those who seek wisdom are entrusted with power. This idea is often treated as a personal ideal or an isolated philosophical demand. Yet it appears instead as the peak of a much broader transformation in human consciousness, one that unfolded across distant regions at roughly the same time. What first emerged was a spiritual upheaval, marked by figures who were seen as both teachers and redeemers. This was followed by a political shift, in which rulers were increasingly imagined not merely as administrators or warriors, but as bearers of salvation. Because of its lasting influence, this era has been described as a turning point in human history. The roots of this transformation lie deep in early civilization. The first urban cultures expanded from Mesopotamia toward the Mediterranean and eastward into the Indus region. Later, waves of Indo-European peoples entered these lands, bringing with them new beliefs about life and death. One striking difference was their practice of cremation rather than burial, a sign of a changed understanding of what survives after death. From the interaction of these traditions, and from centuries of reflection on mortality, a powerful idea slowly took shape: the belief that the soul does not perish. During this period, figures appeared who were believed to have found a way beyond the suffering of ordinary existence. These individuals were thought to experience, even while alive, something of the peace associated with the dead. More than that, they were believed capable of sharing this insight with others. To understand the transformation of the human spirit in this era, it becomes essential to ask how this future state was thought to be anticipated, how release from suffering was believed to occur, and how such experience could be communicated. The belief in the soul's immortality did not arise from abstract reasoning alone. It emerged from forms of experience that were actively cultivated in both East and West centuries before the Common Era. Those who underwent these experiences spoke not as speculators, but as witnesses. They claimed to have touched a reality beyond ordinary life, a state free from fear and decay. This conviction reshaped humanity's relationship with myth. The ancient stories of endless return, cosmic dualism, perpetual life, and unavoidable fate had long served as frameworks for understanding existence. But once immortality was believed to be real, these myths lost their original power. The endless repetition of life came to seem like a trap rather than a promise. The struggle between opposing forces no longer pointed toward heroic action, but toward the need for insight. The longing for eternal life was reinterpreted as the source of suffering itself. Fate ceased to be an inescapable wall and became something from which the soul might be freed. This reversal appears clearly in late epic traditions. In South Asia, the dialogue between a warrior and a divine guide presents immortality as a reason to act without attachment. In the Mediterranean world, later epic poetry reflects a similar shift, portraying the soul as a lasting and elevated being, rather than a shadow bound to the underworld. Although imagery from older traditions remained, the underlying belief had changed. The experience behind these beliefs was not understood as dreaming, memory of past lives, or visual revelation of ultimate reality. Instead, it took the form of awakening. This awakening involved a deep recognition of suffering, an understanding of its cause, and the discovery that peace arises not from fulfilling desire, but from letting it go. The serenity that followed was described as a preview of a state beyond birth and death. This insight appeared in different cultural forms, but followed a shared pattern. Life was seen as marked by dissatisfaction. Desire was identified as the source of repeated existence. Freedom was found through detachment. Wisdom, rather than ritual or power, became the path forward. These ideas were expressed in different languages and symbols, yet they converged on the same conclusion. In Mediterranean philosophy, a comparable vision emerged. A life devoted to examination and self-discipline was described as preparation for death, not in the sense of despair, but as liberation from fear. The goal was release from the cycle of embodied existence and entry into a higher form of being. This release required complete detachment from ordinary attachments and the pursuit of understanding. Yet, an important distinction remained. The wisdom sought in some traditions relied primarily on inner peace as its proof. In others, it demanded justification through reasoned argument. This difference became especially visible in philosophical debates about whether the soul's immortality could be demonstrated intellectually, or whether it rested entirely on experience. Attempts were made to ground immortality in eternal truths that exist beyond time. Some thinkers believed that the mind could unite with these truths through contemplation, thereby sharing in their permanence. Others argued that only an impersonal form of intelligence could truly be eternal, while individual consciousness faded away. These disagreements reflected deeper tensions between personal salvation and impersonal transcendence. Later, thinkers attempted to reconcile these positions by distinguishing levels of reality. Enlightenment was divided into intellectual insight and religious union. Moral freedom was separated from metaphysical certainty. Yet these solutions often left unresolved contradictions, especially concerning the nature of experience itself. A different approach emerged through the idea of freedom. Here, liberation was no longer assumed to be universal, but something to be achieved. The degree of freedom attained reflected the extent to which transcendent truth became active within a person. Immortality, in this view, was not merely survival but transformation. This perspective also altered how magic, religion, and knowledge were understood. Rather than serving human desires, enlightenment aimed to dissolve them. Only a few individuals were thought capable of complete release. Most combined elements of liberation with older systems of belief. When mystical insight blended with magic, it produced disciplines promising extraordinary powers. When combined with religion, it gave rise to initiation, rites offering symbolic rebirth. When joined with natural explanation, it sought peace through understanding the physical world. Each mixture represented a partial liberation, but none achieved full freedom. True liberation began with the recognition that suffering or ignorance was universal. This realization undermined the belief that specific techniques could eliminate all misfortune. It shifted attention inward, toward the roots of dissatisfaction. From this recognition emerged compassion in one tradition, and self-examination in another. Though different in tone, both aimed at freeing individuals from illusions that bound them to fear and desire. Liberation did not require control over nature or divine favor, but clarity of understanding. This shift also changed the role of rulers. Early kings had symbolically shared death on behalf of their people. Later, autocrats claimed universal authority, often grounding their power in cosmic order. Over time, rulers were increasingly expected not only to govern, but to embody wisdom. In some regions, the ideal ruler was imagined as one who spread moral truth throughout the world. In others, the wise ruler was one who embodied balance, rather than teaching doctrine. These ideals converged in the figure of the universal monarch, standing above local laws, yet responsible for harmony among diverse peoples. As empires expanded, rulers were placed above all particular customs. Their authority was seen as transcending law itself. This elevation contributed to the decline of older religious forms and the rise of new devotional movements centered on savior figures. Eventually, a new vision appeared, one that combined life and knowledge rather than forcing a choice between them. In this vision, liberation was not escape from existence, but transformation within it. The Saviour was no longer a king ruling through power or insight alone, but a figure whose presence claimed to fulfill both human longing for truth and human longing for life. Christianity overturned the value system of the ancient world. What earlier cultures had honoured, it questioned. What they had dismissed, it elevated. This reversal has been debated for centuries. Pagan critics once blamed Christianity for the collapse of Rome, arguing that it weakened loyalty to the world and to life itself. Centuries later, similar accusations resurfaced under new intellectual banners, framed not in the language of temples and gods, but in the name of reason, progress, and enlightenment. Yet there is a striking contradiction hidden within many of these critiques. Christianity has often been accused of rejecting life, knowledge, or the world as such. At the same time, one of the most persistent arguments against the Christian God has been the presence of suffering and evil in the world. This deep sensitivity to evil suggests a powerful dissatisfaction with the world as it exists. That dissatisfaction resembles, in an unacknowledged way, the very world negation critics attribute to Christianity. The tension between these positions suggests that before Christianity can be condemned or defended, its transformation of values must first be understood on its own terms. A useful point of comparison comes from an unexpected place. In his final work, Plato abandoned the idea that a wise ruler stands above the law, and instead described a society governed entirely by law. In doing so, he described this legal order as the closest human approximation to divine rule, and referred to it as a city governed by God. This raises an important question. Could a similar transformation be traced in the development of Roman law, especially during and after the rise of Christianity? The answer appears to lie not in theology alone, but in the changing structure of society itself. A Roman emperor once observed that anyone who has lived 40 years and paid attention has already seen everything human life has to offer. The idea behind this claim was simple. Human life across times and places follows the same basic patterns. Birth, ambition, struggle, pleasure, loss, aging, and death repeat endlessly. From this perspective, death does not rob a person of experience, because all essential experience has already occurred. The belief offered a modest form of consolation, suggesting that a full life requires no extension beyond its natural span. Whether human life is truly this uniform is open to question. Even in nature, the assumption that the future will resemble the past cannot be proven. When applied to human societies, the assumption becomes even more uncertain. Still, the widespread success of statistical reasoning and social prediction rests on the belief that human behavior follows regular patterns. If that belief is accepted, then the idea of life's uniformity becomes a practical myth, one capable of giving meaning to mortality. This way of thinking suited the Roman Empire at its height. Expansion had largely ended. The empire no longer defined itself by conquest, but by stability. The political imagination shifted accordingly. Law replaced heroic action as the central organizing principle of life. In this context, Roman law evolved in a significant way. Originally, Roman law applied only to Romans. It preserved the customs, agreements, and remembered actions of a specific people. Deeds, once performed, were thought to live on forever in collective memory. War, especially, was sanctified in this way. Victories were not merely events, but permanent marks on history. This belief in the lasting power of action inspired civic loyalty and sustained the Republic's expansion. As Rome absorbed other peoples, however, its legal system had to adapt. A body of law emerged that applied not only to Romans, but to foreigners. This law was thought to reflect what all peoples had in common. Over time, it simplified Roman legal practices and weakened the authority of uniquely Roman traditions. Gradually, the past ceased to feel eternal and authoritative. As citizenship expanded, Roman identity thinned. The law became universal but less rooted. At the same time, philosophical ideas began to reshape legal thinking. The law shared by all peoples was identified with the law of nature. Rome came to be imagined not merely as a city among others, but as the political form of a universal human community. As the empire stretched across the known world, this idea seemed increasingly plausible. Rome appeared to embody a law, valid everywhere and always. This belief carried profound implications. If Roman law expressed the natural order, then Roman rule itself seemed destined to last forever. Even educated observers could accept this idea despite knowing that empires rise and fall. The universal law gave the particular city a sense of timeless significance. In this vision, death was softened by uniformity. If all human lives followed the same pattern, then a single lifetime was sufficient. The empire itself mirrored this idea, presenting a world where differences mattered less than shared structures. But this solution did not last. When Roman citizenship was extended to all free inhabitants of the empire, the distinction between native law and universal law collapsed. If Roman customs could become universal simply through decree, then customs shared by many peoples were not necessarily natural. The idea of a law rooted in human nature began to lose credibility. Gradually, natural law was redefined. It came to mean not social institutions, but basic biological behaviors shared by humans and animals. Slavery and property were no longer seen as natural, but as products of history. A new idea emerged. Humanity had once existed in a pre-social condition, governed only by instinct. This shift had far-reaching consequences. If social life was conventional rather than natural, then countless alternative forms of life became imaginable. Human experience could no longer be assumed to repeat itself uniformly. A single lifetime no longer contained all possibilities. Death regained its sting. As the old solutions to mortality dissolved, people turned elsewhere. New religious movements promised meaning beyond social order. Christianity emerged in this vacuum. In earlier cultures, the gods had been divided between those of the living and those of the dead. This division shaped every attempt to make sense of death. No solution was acceptable unless it acknowledged the realm of the dead. Christianity changed this framework entirely. It proclaimed a single God for whom both living and dead were alive. This did not solve the problem of death. It dissolved it. Mortality became a mystery rather than a puzzle to be solved. Eternal life was no longer something humans could explain or secure through tradition, law, or philosophy. It belonged entirely to divine knowledge. This transformation unsettled society. Law had always been understood as the rule of the gods of the living. Its limits were accepted because death lay beyond their power. Once the gods of the dead were denied, the foundations of law had to be rethought. Two paths emerged. One was to declare the law divine, extending its authority without limit. The other was to accept law as human and therefore limited. History followed both paths at once. Public authority increasingly claimed divine backing, while private law became more openly human and changeable. This shift ended the need to treat rulers as gods after death. Their authority no longer depended on personal divinity. Laws could now be revised, repealed, or replaced without denying cosmic order. The empire remained sacred in theory, but its rules became flexible in practice. In the East, the empire continued to be seen as a divine institution. In the West, where the empire collapsed, a different view prevailed. Law was human. Power was temporary. Only the divine order endured. This distinction shaped a new vision of society as divided between two communities. One bound to the world and one oriented beyond it. These were not geographical cities, but ways of life. Both existed side by side in history. Earlier thinkers had imagined ideal societies as reflections of a perfect order beyond the world. But those ideals remained symbolic. Christianity claimed something more radical. The higher community was not merely a model. It was real, unfolding through history, beginning before recorded time and continuing into the future. This left the earthly community exposed. Once stripped of divine destiny, it faced mortality without consolation. Attempts to restore sacred meaning to political order repeatedly followed. Each time, they met resistance. There is a striking difference between the biblical and Quranic accounts of the Garden of Paradise and the act that led to humanity's expulsion. In the biblical narrative, the garden contains two distinct trees. the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Humanity's transgression lies in eating from the tree of knowledge. In the Quranic account, however, only a single tree appears. It is described as the tree of immortality, the tree that promises an everlasting kingdom. In this version, humanity's error is not the pursuit of knowledge, but the desire for eternal life. A similar ambiguity appears in Dante's vision of paradise. In the Divine Comedy, paradise also contains only one tree, the tree associated with humanity's fall. Dante never clearly defines whether this tree represents knowledge or life. What becomes evident, however, is its symbolic connection to earthly power and to a form of rule imagined as enduring and universal. In Dante's vision, the violation of this tree disrupts the proper order of the world. Its restoration would allow humanity to enjoy a universal earthly realm governed by justice and harmony. From this perspective, Dante presents a world with two destinations for humanity. One is an earthly paradise to be regained through an ideal political order. The other is a heavenly paradise reached through spiritual union with the divine. This idea that humanity has two ultimate ends, rather than one, carried enormous consequences. Dante was not alone in advancing it. Across the Middle Ages, thinkers repeatedly attempted to reconcile Christianity with a philosophy that could address humanity's earthly ambitions as well as its spiritual hopes. That philosophy was embedded in the hierarchical structure of medieval society. It functioned as a political myth, offering continuity, meaning, and an answer to death. Dante stands near the end of the effective life of the medieval empire, just as Shakespeare stands near the end of the medieval kingdom. Together, they capture both the aspirations of hierarchical society and its growing inability to account for human experience. Dante reflects its ideals. Shakespeare exposes its fractures. Through them, the medieval world reveals its attempt to exist between two realities, this world and another, and the tensions created by that divided vision. Dante described his imagined journey through the afterlife as a comedy, not because it is humorous, but because it ends in fulfillment. The journey concludes first in the earthly paradise and then in the heavenly one. In his political writings, Dante explains this structure explicitly. Humanity, he argues, pursues two forms of happiness, one rooted in earthly life, the other in eternal life. Earthly happiness belongs to the domain of political order. Heavenly happiness belongs to the domain of spiritual authority. In Dante's system, the emperor guides humanity toward fulfillment on earth, while the Pope guides it toward fulfillment beyond the world. This vision was meant to resolve the long-standing conflict between empire and church. It assumes a society fundamentally different from the modern world, not only in political structure, but in its understanding of life and death. Hierarchical society rested on the belief that each individual occupied a defined place, reinforced by custom, obligation, and inheritance. Identity was tied to role. Continuity was achieved through succession. A person endured by being replaced. Immortality took the form of stability. In contrast, modern equalitarian societies tend to experience life as a race against time, driven by competition, mobility, and dissatisfaction. Hierarchy once promised permanence. Equality offers movement, but rarely rest. Late Roman society had already become hierarchical, but it did so under coercion. Positions were fixed by law and enforced by punishment. The medieval hierarchy, by contrast, emerged through personal bonds. A person's place in society was secured by loyalty and obligation rather than compulsion. Land was held through relationships. Authority flowed through oaths. Identity became relational. As this system matured, it became possible to imagine personal identity, as something preserved through social continuity. So long as the structure endured, the individual endured. This belief helped sustain the idea that medieval society was a continuation of Rome. Even when political reality changed, the name Roman Empire remained necessary. The claim of continuity itself became a solution to mortality. Medieval rulers adopted titles that linked political authority to divine purpose. In the East, emperors were described as ruling alongside God. In the West, rulers preferred the more modest language of representation, describing themselves as God's vicars. Even so, the implication remained that social order reflected divine order. When a king died, the reign of God continued. Over time, however, this claim was challenged. The conflict between empire and papacy was not merely about power, it was a struggle over how society should confront death. The imperial vision treated hierarchy itself as a Christian answer to mortality. The papal vision questioned this assumption. Practices such as clerical celibacy symbolized a rejection of inherited continuity and stood as a quiet protest against the idea that immortality could be achieved through social roles. Alongside this resistance emerged a new form of mysticism. Earlier, mystical traditions treated hierarchy as a ladder toward divine truth. Medieval thinkers increasingly treated hierarchy as something temporary, even dispensable. The ultimate goal became direct encounter rather than ordered ascent. This tension shaped Dante's thought. Drawing on philosophical traditions, he argued that humanity's role on Earth was to realize the full potential of the human intellect. No individual could do this alone. The task required a complete society, each person fulfilling a specific function. Knowledge was distributed across ranks and preserved through generations. At any moment, humanity as a whole possessed the totality of what could be known. This vision required a stable hierarchy and an eternal political order. Yet, it left the individual incomplete. Personal fulfillment remained unattainable without divine union. Dante accepted this cost. The collective achieved permanence. The individual awaited completion elsewhere. This imbalance eventually became unbearable. As attention shifted increasingly toward life on Earth, the gap between collective immortality and personal mortality widened. By the late Middle Ages, death reasserted itself as a visible presence. Art and ritual began to emphasize decay and equality in death. The dance of death portrayed kings and peasants alike, led away by the same figure. In time, tragedy returned. Shakespeare's plays reveal a world where hierarchy no longer consoles. Kings embody the entire political order, yet they die like any other human being. The crown appears immortal, but the head beneath it is not. Power amplifies mortality, rather than overcoming it. Shakespeare's histories are filled with fallen kings, poisoned kings, murdered kings. What disturbs the audience is not merely their fate, but the contrast between their symbolic greatness and their physical fragility. A king may represent a nation, yet he still eats, sleeps, fears, and dies. In this world, greatness no longer defeats death. It exposes it. Dispossessed rulers see through the illusion of status. Once stripped of ceremony, only mortality remains. Those who seek power through violence discover that greatness does not protect them from time. Tomorrow follows tomorrow, each step leading closer to extinction. Comedy, too, reflects this awareness. Jesters mock authority. Gravediggers handle skulls. Emperors become dust. The humour does not deny death, it insists on it. The contrast between form and flesh becomes unavoidable. Unlike Dante's vision, where earthly hierarchy is mirrored by heavenly order, Shakespeare offers no such symmetry. The afterlife recedes. What remains is time, decay, and memory. When greatness can no longer conceal mortality, it becomes intolerable. Death cannot be removed. What must go instead is the belief that social hierarchy grants meaning beyond the individual life. When Thomas Hobbes described the political order as a mortal god, he marked a decisive turning point in the way power, authority, and meaning were understood. His choice of words signaled the emergence of a new political imagination. Hobbes intended the phrase as a more respectful name for the Commonwealth than the biblical monster he had previously used. Yet for anyone familiar with earlier legal traditions, the shock lay not only in the word God, but in the word mortal. For centuries, political thought had rested on the idea that authority possessed a form of immortality. Hobbes inverted this assumption. Power, he suggested, lives and dies. This image did not emerge in isolation. It echoed older Christian ideas in unexpected ways. The execution of kings such as Charles I and Louis XVI did not simply represent the collapse of monarchy. It exposed a deeper transformation in how people understood sovereignty. These rulers were not only political figures. They had come to see themselves as symbolic figures, walking a path of sacrifice and martyrdom. Their deaths did not end religious thinking about power. Instead, they carried it forward in a modern form. Earlier, political myths had rested on the belief that the ruler possessed two forms of existence. One was physical and vulnerable. The other was symbolic and enduring. Over time, this belief lost credibility. A new idea took its place. Power itself was mortal. Authority could rise, act, and collapse. This idea did not eliminate religious symbolism, it reshaped it. The image of a god who could die began to shadow modern revolutions, shaping how human freedom and violence were imagined. As this transformation unfolded, attention turned toward a deeper question: how to live in a world where neither gods nor political structures offered permanence. Ancient thinkers had already wrestled with this problem. Some concluded that death was nothing to fear. Others argued that meaning could exist, even without divine oversight. In the modern era, these reflections hardened into a stark claim. The world had lost its gods. This claim did not mean the disappearance of belief. It meant a shift in its focus. The idea of a hidden god, present through absence rather than authority, had already taken root. Suffering, abandonment, and silence became central experiences. Over time, these experiences were interpreted in different ways. Some saw them as signs of faith. Others treated them as evidence that the divine had withdrawn entirely. From this tension emerged a powerful modern myth: the death of God. This phrase did not simply deny belief. It expressed a new form of spiritual experience. It suggested that humanity now stood alone, responsible for its own fate. The loss of divine protection became the condition for absolute freedom. This experience appeared in both religious and secular forms. In some traditions, it was described as a trial of faith. In others, it became a declaration of independence. What united them was the sense that human beings could no longer rely on anything beyond themselves to overcome suffering and death. As political authority absorbed this shift, sovereignty itself began to change. Death came to be seen as the ultimate power, the force behind all domination. Kings, states, and institutions seemed powerful only because they controlled life and death. This realization shaped the political imagination of early modern Europe. Some thinkers attempted to ground authority in divine command. Others sought to anchor it in reason or popular will. Yet beneath these differences lay the same anxiety: how to live under the shadow of death without surrendering to despair. Hobbes responded by concentrating power. If death ruled the world, then only a unified authority strong enough to command obedience could prevent chaos. The state became a mortal god, not because it was divine, but because it held the power once attributed to divinity. Later, thinkers attempted to soften this vision. Some argued that political power should be limited, not absolute. Others insisted that sovereignty belonged to the people. Yet these solutions often reproduced the same problem in a new form. When power shifted from kings to the people, the question remained: who decides over life and death? Revolutionary movements revealed the danger of this logic. When authority claimed to act in the name of reason or virtue, violence became justified as necessity. Terror was no longer an accident, it was presented as a tool of progress. The modern state thus inherited a paradox. It promised freedom, yet relied on the same power that had once justified tyranny. The struggle between protecting life and controlling it defined political conflicts for centuries. Some societies attempted to resolve this tension by declaring certain rights untouchable. Life, liberty, and personal dignity were placed beyond political reach. Power was no longer absolute. It was conditional. Its legitimacy depended on restraint. Other societies moved in the opposite direction. They embraced the idea that true freedom required total control. In these systems, the state claimed authority over existence itself. Violence became a sign of commitment. Sacrifice was praised. Death was no longer feared but embraced as proof of loyalty. These paths produced radically different outcomes. Where power was limited, death remained tragic but not glorified. Where power was unlimited, death became a political instrument. The 20th century exposed the consequences of these choices. Totalitarian systems pushed the logic of absolute sovereignty to its extreme. They sought to master death by commanding it. Yet in doing so, they multiplied it. As these systems collapsed, a profound revulsion followed. The promise of autonomy through domination had failed. Freedom achieved through terror proved hollow. The question of death returned, unresolved. Modern thought has increasingly turned toward the future for answers. Hope shifted away from fixed systems toward openness and possibility. Yet even this future remained fragile. It could inspire creativity or justify destruction. Philosophers began to question autonomy itself. They asked whether reason could truly govern reality, or whether it merely shaped appearances. They observed that scientific systems changed over time, while ideals endured. Knowledge advanced, but certainty remained elusive. This insight suggested a new humility. Human achievements were provisional. Meaning could not be fixed once and for all. Neither power nor reason could fully overcome mortality. From this perspective, the future gained a new role. It was no longer a destination guaranteed by progress, nor a threat to be conquered. It became a space of openness, where meaning could emerge without violence. The challenge remains unresolved. The desire to control life persists. The temptation to turn autonomy into domination remains strong. Yet the memory of its consequences lingers. What emerges from this long struggle is not a final answer, but a warning. Any attempt to master death through power risks becoming death's instrument. A society that forgets this lesson may repeat the cycle once more. Across the long span of human history, the deepest struggle has never truly been a struggle between peoples, nations, races, or classes. Beneath every visible conflict lies a more fundamental contest, one shared by all human beings without exception. It is the struggle against death. From the moment humanity became conscious of its own mortality, life has unfolded as a search for ways to resist, delay, reinterpret, or overcome that final limit. The image of Gilgamesh wandering across desolate landscapes in search of unending life captures this condition with haunting clarity. He is not merely a legendary king. he is a reflection of humanity itself, moving through centuries of thought, belief, and experiment, driven by the same question: how can life be preserved when death is inevitable? The idea of endless bodily life has always remained an ideal rather than a realistic expectation. No civilization has seriously believed that an entire society could escape death altogether. Instead, the problem has usually taken a different form. If death cannot be avoided, then the question becomes how life can still feel complete. What can be done, knowing that life will end, to satisfy the desire to live? This question touches every dimension of existence. It asks what life means, what actions matter, and what kind of hope remains possible. To answer it fully would be to resolve all other questions at once. The earliest answers did not deny death, but sought substitutes for immortality. When access to eternal life was lost, life itself was redirected toward continuity through birth, memory, and shared experience. The figure of the mother of the living became a stand-in for the unreachable promise of endless life. Through her, life continued even as individual lives ended. In the earliest cities, life and death were not separated experiences. Kings, gods, and communities were bound together in rituals that allowed mortals to share symbolically in both life and death. Through these shared experiences, people believed they gained insight into the forces governing existence. Life was understood through death, and death through life. This closeness to death did not bring peace. Instead, it sharpened desire. The awareness of mortality intensified the longing for renewal and permanence. Gilgamesh's quest began not from ignorance, but from knowledge. Having witnessed death directly, he could no longer accept life without seeking more from it. His failure expressed not only disappointment, but the realization that this longing could not be fulfilled by human effort. Other cultures pursued different paths. In some societies, identity was tied closely to the body itself. Preservation of the body became a way of preserving the self. Survival was understood not as continued activity, but as continuity of presence. The living carried forward the experience of the dead by repeating their lives, roles, and patterns. Memory became inheritance. Repetition became survival. This way of thinking relied on continuity. It assumed that life followed recognizable cycles, and that each generation would reenact what came before. When those cycles were broken, the sense of meaning collapsed. Periods of disruption create the feeling of being cut off from both past and future, trapped in a fragile present where only the moment remained. As confidence in shared life between gods and humans faded, cities gradually redefined themselves. They became communities of people rather than meeting places of mortals and immortals. Conflicts once framed as sacred struggles lost their divine justification. War, stripped of cosmic meaning, began to appear pointless. This shift is visible in the great epic narratives. When divine purpose receded, heroism itself changed character. Battles that once promised glory came to resemble elaborate ways of dying. Courage became questionable when the causes it served appeared empty. The awareness of blindness entered human self-understanding. Yet the desire to live did not disappear. It changed direction. Instead of seeking immortality through gods, people sought it through human connection. The city became a community bound by shared memory rather than divine presence. The past itself took on an immortal character. What had happened could never be undone. Deeds became permanent. History became eternal. In this vision, a person lived on through actions rather than through continued existence. A city endured through its story even if its walls fell. Life was defined as a sequence of deeds that could not be erased. This understanding offered a powerful sense of meaning, but it also carried a tragic weight. Wrong actions could never be undone. Guilt endured as firmly as honor. Over time, thinkers began to question whether even this form of immortality was secure. Doubts arose about whether the past itself was truly permanent, or whether time dissolved everything it touched. Attention shifted away from deeds toward inner understanding. The focus moved from action to awareness, from doing to knowing, from living fully to learning how to let go. This marked a turning point. Some philosophies no longer sought to solve the problem of death, but to dissolve it by renouncing the desire to live altogether. Life was understood as suffering generated by attachment. Freedom was imagined as release from desire rather than fulfillment of it. Attempts were made to organize societies around this insight. Leaders were elevated as figures who stood above ordinary law, embodying a higher form of existence. Yet these experiments could not fully escape the realities they sought to transcend. Most people continued to live within inherited patterns that addressed death indirectly, rather than abandoning the struggle entirely. Later, empires offered new answers. Life was redefined as a range of experiences rather than a sequence of deeds. To live fully meant to pass through all stages of human existence. Uniformity replaced distinction. If everyone shared the same experiences, then living anywhere was equivalent to living everywhere. This solution eventually lost credibility. Uniform life appeared artificial. The promise of permanence faded. Societies responded by reintroducing hierarchy. Identity became tied to role. Meaning came from status. A person lived on through the position they occupied, rather than through personal experience. This system offered continuity, but it left an unresolved tension. Private mortality remained untouched by public greatness. Status endured, but individuals still died. Over time, this contrast became unbearable. Art and literature exposed the emptiness of survival without personal fulfillment. From this tension emerged a new understanding. Death itself appeared as the ultimate ruler. No matter how high a person rose, death reduced all distinctions to nothing. Authority lost its claim to permanence. Power became temporary. Once death was understood as sovereign, society faced a new challenge. Either life had to be protected against death by guaranteeing individual rights, or death had to be mastered by placing power over life in human hands. These two paths defined modern political history. One path limited power. It treated life as inviolable. Death became an event rather than a judgment. The other path embraced absolute power. It treated control over life and death as the highest expression of freedom. This path repeatedly led to terror. Violence becomes inevitable when life is reduced to something to be disposed of. Terror arises when the desire to live turns into the desire to command life itself. Where there is no future beyond death, death becomes a tool. Where another future is imagined, restraint becomes possible. Life can be valued without being controlled. Meaning can exist without domination. Human history reveals countless attempts to satisfy the desire to live. Some have partially succeeded. Experience has been shared. Memory has endured. Deeds have shaped history. Freedom has been claimed. Even chosen deaths have carried meaning. Yet none of these solutions has fully overcome death. This persistent failure raises a question. Perhaps the desire to live cannot be completely satisfied by human effort. Perhaps what must be relinquished is not the desire itself, but the attempt to fulfill it alone. Human beings know how to live, how to remember, how to act, how to endure, how to die freely. What remains beyond reach is the power to give life back once it has been laid down. That power lies outside human capacity. This recognition does not eliminate hope. It reshapes it. Hope becomes oriented not toward escaping death, but toward finding life beyond it. The final hope is not survival through memory or status, but renewal beyond loss. Through every age, cities have remained shaped by gods of one kind or another. Whether gods of life, gods of death, or ideas that replaced them, society has always organized itself around answers to mortality. If a time should come when humanity no longer tries to secure life by its own power, without abandoning the desire to live, then courage would take a new form. Freedom would no longer mean control over life and death, but the willingness to entrust life beyond oneself.